Alright, today I'm going to get that floor patched, come hell or high water. We need to move on, there's a lot of work to do. So basically I've got another piece of OBS outside that I'm going to cut, stick in this hole that you can see. Right here. I put some plumbing in yesterday so that I can cut a hole and get down into that. I had to cut some plumbing. May end up cutting a little bit more or taking some of this stuff out. I'm going to have to cut power to the RV for a little bit, maybe on battery. So we'll figure out how to deal with that. Anyways, let's get started. We're going to be listening to a Michael Malice podcast. So I'm going to share that. Oh shit, I'm not. Well, I guess I am streaming. Okay. So we're going to start this. Let's see. Share. Sure. I got a mouse here. I'm using the touchpad, which is kind of like cardinal sin. Who hates a touchpad? I hate a touchpad. Eh. Alright, so we're going to start this. I don't even know who this person is, but I tend to listen to these because I
Good afternoon, Michael Malice here. Let that be your welcome for the next hour. I am kind of ecstatic to have our next guest here with us today. It is my old pal from the Lollipop Guild, Kristen Tate. I've not talked to her forever. She was a partner with me on Red Eye and Kennedy. We used to do all the shows together. She's one of my absolute favorite people. For those who don't know, she has 3 books under her belt. How Do I Tax Thee, which is about hidden taxes in our everyday lives, which is very important because they're very regressive. If there's that hidden $5 tax on an airplane ticket, someone who's wealthy is not going to care, but the poor people are the ones who end up getting hurt the most, and there's no one really advocating for that. So her book covers all that. It's very interesting. Her first book was called Government Gone Wild. Her most recent book, which we're going to get into in a second, is called The Liberal Invasion of Red State America. And here's the story of Kristen Tate. Okay? There's this movie called She's All That, and basically Kristen Tate was the inspiration for this movie, because there's this really, really nerdy, dorky girl, and then she grew up and became a dime, and people don't realize that she's still a nerdy, dorky girl, but she really is, and talking to Kristen about politics is some of the most number-crunchy, wonky stuff, and it's just amazing to have you back on the show. How have you been?
I'm so excited to be here. Oh my gosh, I've missed talking to you, and I'm just so happy to be here. Thank you for having me on. Although I wish we could be in person. This whole COVID world is really a bummer.
Well, let me tell you why I was so excited to talk to you, because I am moving to Austin for sure. 100%.
Really? I didn't know that.
Yeah, I just decided this weekend. I'll tell you exactly when. It, I was on the fence, and two things happened. One is, for me, being a lifelong New Yorker, the dream always was to have a townhouse, right? Have a townhouse in New York, you've arrived. They have townhouses in Austin. I didn't think that was a thing. My friend just moved into one, so I'm like, okay, I can have my townhouse and really Pee-wee's Playhouse it out. But when you're in New York, as long as I am, like you see certain trends that happen over years. Some things get worse, some things get better. Something that was very emblematic of 1970s New York, which was New York kind of at its worst, and you see all those photos where the photos don't show you how smelly and violent and filthy it was and dangerous, was boomboxes everywhere. In fact, still if you go on the subway in New York, there'll be signs that say like no eating, no littering, and no boomboxes. We have reached a point now in New York, and this has happened the last 9 months, where it's perfectly acceptable to walk around the book bag with a speaker in it and just blast it wherever you go on the street. Everyone's scared to say anything, and the cops aren't going to do anything. And the moment where I'm like, that's it, I'm done. I was at my gym, which is not some kind of fancy Equinox gym. It's a regular neighborhood gym. And there was a guy in the locker room blasting his music, and he called a member of the staff because he had forgotten the code to his locker. And the member of the staff came in, helped him get his stuff, and didn't say anything about the music. And I'm like, you know what? If I have to be a crotchety old man, I'm out of it. I hear. Because that is also something that, like, was it James Q. Wilson from the Manhattan Institute with the broken window policing, with the whole idea of once you let certain things go, like if people just leave those windows broken, other people realize, wait a minute, I can get away with whatever I want, and that's what leads to crime. I don't know how true that is, but for quality of life, it's not at all a concern with this administration, and it's only going to be getting worse. So I've had enough. All my friends are out of here. I'm out of here. I'm going to find a place. And when I was musing about this on Twitter, why this long setup, everyone kept telling me over and over, stop coming. You can come here, just don't vote the way you voted back at home. Now, I don't believe in voting, but on a personal level, but your whole book was about this exact topic, of internal migration, and how people are voting, moving from blue states to red states, and how that's going to affect things on a national and statewide level. So I really want to give you the floor and talk about whether is this a real concern and what are the ramifications of it.
Well, first of all, I'm so happy to hear you're moving to Texas. Welcome to Texas, baby. This place is awesome. We have not been masking at all for like almost the whole year. I mean, a couple of the liberal pockets did the whole mask thing for a while. In fact, Austin was like the one place that had a mask mandate for quite a while. But you're going to be very happy down here. And when I hear that Michael Malice, the person who I perhaps most associate with New York, is moving to Texas, that tells me that these trends are, in full swing. Because I know you're a lifelong New Yorker.
I don't know how to drive. I'm going to have to learn how to drive.
Yeah, you're going to have to learn how to drive for sure. But yeah, I mean, so many people have made that same move that you're about to make. And it's really interesting because this whole idea of domestic migration has really burst into the mainstream media's narrative. And I was interested in this before this became, this large trend that's widely talked about. I started writing the book maybe 3 years ago, so it's been a long-term project for me. And the reason I became interested in domestic migration is actually because I grew up in New Hampshire, which was, when I grew up, a very libertarian, sort of actually right of center state. The people up there, they liked to be left alone. A lot of people were off the grid. Part of my childhood, I was practically off the grid. We didn't have TV or anything like that. No AC. Very much do everything yourself. We grew our own vegetables. So I grew up there. That's sort of how my politics were formed, just by this do-it-yourself, pick yourself up by your bootstraps attitude that New Hampshire really embraced back when it was this sort of libertarian, leave us alone state. But as I grew up, the political environment up there really changed significantly, to the point where the whole bottom half of New Hampshire is now solidly blue. The top half that's where you're going to find the real, New Hampshireites. But the bottom half of that state is now completely blue. It's been totally taken over by people who moved up there from Boston. And
Oh God.
I don't.
It's like a sewage pipe like broke or
Yes.
something.
Oh, it's absolutely like a sewage pipe, and they've ruined the state. People still call it a purple state. It's not. I mean, I would be shocked if in a presidential race it ever went Republican, at least for the next few decades. So anyway, I saw this happening in my home state, and I got really interested in the idea of domestic migration. And then I moved to Texas, and I noticed similar things happening here, particularly with Californians moving to Texas. So I started doing a little research, and I realized this is having a profound impact on the country in a number of ways, politically, culturally, economically. So that's how I got interested in this trend. And I think that domestic migration will have a larger impact on our politics in the short term than immigration. And obviously, Republicans love talking about the border and immigration, and I certainly think that's an important topic as well. But they are totally missing the real threat to their electoral power, which is this domestic migration. So I'm sure, I don't know if you saw the most recent census numbers, but Texas picked up a couple of congressional seats, Florida did, New York, California, Illinois, they're all losing seats. And it's so obvious what's going on. These policies are failing. These blue state policies are utterly failing families and, single professionals. Everyone's being failed by them. Older retirees who are on fixed incomes, they're all out of these places because you have these exorbitant taxes that go up every single year on working people. You have out of control costs of living, which I covered in How to a Tax Fee. And okay, you have these high costs of living, you have the high taxes. People who are wealthy will be willing to pay that for a good quality of life. But the quality of life is down the tubes now. I mean, when I lived in New York, I was living on the Upper East Side, a fairly safe area. And I was up in the 90s on like 92nd Street. There was a girl who was assaulted in broad daylight up one street away from where I used to live. I mean, this is commonplace now. People are getting attacked randomly on the streets in New York for no reason at all in formerly very safe neighborhoods. So people are leaving these blue states. They're leaving the big cities and the blue states. They're going to California, or they're going to Florida, they're going to Texas, they're even going to places like Oklahoma, places that don't seem as fun. They are gaining population as well. And what's really sad about this is that as these blue state policies are failing, the Biden administration is rolling out similar policies on a federal level, right? And if we do that, there's nowhere to flee, right? I mean, if we're all stuck with this nonsense, where are we going to flee to? So, yeah, I mean, I still think that red states
started on new cities.
But I'm
That's
very
my goal.
concerned about red states because we're absorbing so many of you blue staters who come down here and vote in favor of the same Democratic policies you left. And it could make it a lot harder for Republicans to win in elections. But more importantly, it could result in just creating the same exact kinds of environment that New Yorkers and Californians are fleeing. I mean, Austin is a great city. You're going to love it. But it's definitely moving in the wrong direction. I mean, there are like homeless detention camps all over the place. And this is getting worse by the year, like in a noticeable way. You can tell every single year these kinds of problems get worse. And I'm telling you, it's because primarily the Californians who moved there and they just recreate the image of California. They're doing it to Florida too. The New Yorkers are doing it down there. So the question is obviously, what do we do about this, right? How do we fix the problem? And I mean, there's really no answer other than try to reach out to your new neighbors in these red states and explain to them why these red states have flourished. And, I'm kind of a libertarian, so I don't think Republicans are always that great, but I think their policies are a hell of a lot less destructive than the Democrats, who have totally just abandoned their own people for political convenience. New York is just the perfect example. It's so sad what's happening there. I mean, you see it firsthand every day. I don't need to tell you, but I was there last March or something, last March 2020, right before COVID hit. And even before COVID, I noticed that city is just not what it used to be. It's really, really sad because I still believe New York is the best city in the world. I still believe that. And I'd love to go back there someday, but the way the direction it's moving in right now, I'm not sure it's going to be able to recover, especially because industry is not tethered to New York anymore. So, you know, when New York kind of crawled out of its recession that it experienced in the early 80s, late 70s, it was the banking industry, fashion, you know, all the arts, the industries that were sort of tethered to New York and could not exist anywhere else. But now, I mean, you have J.P. Morgan, more than half their workforce isn't even in New York anymore. You have these big banks. I mean, Wall Street is a ghost town, but Wall Street is still operating. I mean, people are still making trades every day. They don't need to be on Wall Street. So because industry doesn't have to be in New York anymore, I think it'll be a lot harder for New York to bounce back if they ever vote in favor of another Giuliani. And I don't even think they will vote for another Giuliani. I think they're going to just keep doubling down on these policies. It'll get worse and worse. And ultimately, New York could become a big burned out city like Detroit. And that would be so sad. That would break my heart. But that looks like probably the future New York's heading for.
There's an expression in Judaism called sitting Shiva, which is when you have someone in your family who passes away, you know, it's an extended period of time where basically you cover the mirrors, you're not allowed to, it's just this whole process. And in extreme cases, you sit Shiva when you like disown your kids. Like if they do something really outrageous, you basically pretend they're dead and never comes to your house and offers you solace. And that's what I want to feel. That's what I'm basically doing for New York. Like the level, I have been ride or die for this city for so long. I've defended it against everything. Like when people are like, it's dirty, it's filthy, it's that, I'm like, you don't get it. It's awesome, you know, just championing everything. And I am now, what these people have done to my beloved city, I will never forgive them. I will never not be angry. I will never not be sad. Like the level of so many negative emotions, I cannot even begin to express myself. And frankly, at this point, I'd be more than happy to just burn it down and start all over again. Because they've just taken this wonderful thing, this wonderful creation, this beautiful, you know, Lady Liberty lives here, sorry, New Jersey, and they're just basically like beating and raping her in front of me, and I can't stand it. It drives me so up the wall, I don't even know where to begin. And the thing is, there's absolutely no possibility that it's going to be getting better. Giuliani was only here after Dinkins, and he barely been through in '93. This was a precursor to the 1994 Republican Revolution that took Congress for the first time in 40 years. But, I mean, Dinkins, it was really, really bad. When the murder rate was through the roof, he announced he was going to crack down on jaywalking. He was shutting down the libraries, and it was just such a perversion of what you would want a city to be governed by. And we're seeing it now in New York and Chicago and these other places. No one is more aggressive against the police than me. But the reason I am so aggressive against the police is because I'm against a government monopoly in terms of providing a service. And what happens when you have failed policing and when you politicize security, it's the people who I'm most worried about are the elderly poor. Because they have been in these apartments in these cities for decades. They're the first ones who are going to get robbed. They're the first ones who are going to get sucker punched on the street. They have no recourse. And I'll put my lib hat on, like they're the weakest, but they're the ones who are going to be the biggest victims, and no one's going to care because there's no narrative about what about these poor old people. You're seeing right now, there was a congresswoman, a state congresswoman, I believe, or some city councilwoman out of California, and we're seeing a huge spike in assaults against Asian Americans by African Americans, and she said we need to talk about how white supremacy is the cause of all this or feeds into this, and it's like, I am not interested in having a conversation with you. Because if you are just interested in, like, let's point fingers instead of, wait a minute, random wanton assaults. Like, back in the day in New York, the crime, I mean, to even try to put this in context is disgusting, but the crime had a purpose because people were robbing you for your money.
They would take your Walkman, they would take your money. They are beating people for no reason.
There was that story about an elderly lady that really stuck with me who was walking down the street last year. I think it was over the summer, and just walking, minding her own business. I think it was the Upper East Side. And did you remember this? And this guy comes up behind her and just sucker punches her right in the head. She falls into a fire hydrant. And they finally caught the guy after weeks go by. And oh, lo and behold, this is someone who's been in prison a bunch of times, got released early. This is what happens with these policies. Everyone's getting released from prison, and then, oh, shocker, they go and they commit more crimes. It's really very sad, and like you say, it's the people who can't afford to move. You and I, we're mobile, we can afford to move if we have to. There are lots of people who live in New York who can't do that. Elderly people in particular who are on a fixed income and have been there forever. They can't just pick up and move to Austin. They're at the mercy of whatever these people do to New York. And, the difference between the time period when Dinkins was in power was that at least New York had industry, right? Industry never left New York. The industry is leaving New York. The fact that you have NASDAQ now considering Dallas as, their new headquarters, that right there, if they decide to move to Dallas, that would devastate New York. Just that one company. We see JP Morgan and these other banks moving out of the city. Once industry leaves, the jobs will leave, and the productive members of society will leave as well. They will go where the jobs are, and all you will have left are the poor and the criminals. And that's when you're going to have a real problem. That's when it becomes the Wild West and complete anarchy on the streets.
Well, not the kind of anarchy I like.
Right.
But there's also another element of that, which is, besides the industry and the banks and all the preppy people, New York has always been a magnet for creative people.
Mm-hmm.
You've had Broadway, you have the hipster neighborhoods, Williamsburg and Greenpoint, things like that. If I were a young entrepreneur and I wanted to create an ice cream shop or a restaurant or a boutique or any of these little quirky things that give New York or any city character, why would I start it in New York now when not only is the rent going to be through the roof, where the people have gone, and I have an entire business climate extremely hostile to making sure I can't get started, whereas starting any business is incredibly difficult, it's such an uphill battle. Wouldn't I rather be the coolest restaurant in Oklahoma City and get lots of internet buzz and be a big fish in a small pond, as opposed to being DOA in New York or selling my stuff on Etsy? Just the incentives do not line up, and I think this is something you talk a lot about in your work, and I would love to hear your thoughts on this. There is a complete lack, and it's like they talk about systemic racism. There's a complete lack on the left, of the broader left, of understanding or even discussing the idea that people respond to incentives. They do not ever talk in these terms or think in these terms, and yet that is a great way to motivate people to do things, and more importantly, to drive people away.
That's exactly right, especially when you're talking about business owners and small business owners. There's a reason why there's so much growth, corporate growth in Texas. And it's because these entrepreneurs are responding to incentives. Austin, I would argue the city of Austin is just as cool now as Brooklyn, maybe even getting cooler. You have these interesting little companies popping up. You have these incredible restaurants. The culture is just getting more interesting by the day. Museums, everything you could ever want in the city is now in Austin. I can tell you it was not like that a decade ago in Austin. And it's because the creative people are going there too. They're following the industry, and I just think that if these blue cities, these blue state cities want to come back and they want to return to their former glory, they will need to incentivize business growth, which they are just not doing right now. Elon Musk, I'm sure you saw this, Elon Musk is relocating to Austin.
Yeah.
It's not just the small startups, it's the big guys too, which bring thousands and thousands of jobs with them. I'm in Houston, we have HP coming down here, Oracle. These are all companies with thousands of people. And a lot of those employees are young creatives, and they will contribute to the culture when they get here. And what concerns me about it, part of this is very vindicating for me, obviously, because people are coming to the places that have fiscal conservatism and a more red sort of way about them. But I'm worried about the future of these places, because part of what I did for my book is I looked at election results over a span of time and compared that with the domestic migration rate. And nearly every suburban county in the state of Texas has been trending blue, especially the ones that are getting the most people from these blue states. But same in Florida, with a few exceptions. Florida is kind of a weird political animal because we have a lot of retirees and students who tend to vote right in the sector. But Florida's a little different, but Texas, Arizona, Colorado, a lot of these states that are particularly representing Californians, you can look at every single county that's receiving the most domestic migrations, and every single one of them is trending to the left in local and state and national elections. It's very consistent. So that's what concerns me about it most. I'm not sure that people really think about politics when they move. They're thinking about the quality of life, they're thinking about culture, jobs, but they're not connecting the dots. Well, why is it that there's a great culture down in Austin? Why is it that there are great paying jobs? Why is it that you can afford a house without making millions of dollars a year? There's a reason for all of that. But people don't necessarily connect those dots, so they just mindlessly keep voting for the big government, lefties that they voted for back home. So part of this is just opening people's eyes up to what's happening. Otherwise, we're just going to have a situation where, Austin will just be the next San Francisco, and then we're going to have to find a new place to move. It'll just be like a never-ending cycle, I suppose. But at the same time, as I mentioned earlier, Biden is federalizing a lot of this toxic left-wing policy. He's obviously raising taxes on families now. He said it was only going to be on people who make over $400,000 a year. We now know it's $200,000 a year because if you're married, it's by household. Not indexed for inflation, by the way. So we all know inflation's about to set in. So that could essentially apply to middle-class earners.
Boy, how quickly things have changed with one administration.
Corporate tax is now
I hope the left realizes how naive they were.
So all of these blue state policies, what I'm worried about is they'll become inescapable because Biden is going to federalize them. And at the same time, by the way, he is rewarding the blue states that are making these bad financial decisions by giving them massive subsidies. Like the COVID bill, for example, the last one that they just passed. It gave aid to almost every single state, but it said if you're a state that cuts taxes, you don't get any of this aid. Basically just incentivizing these states to continue bloating.
That 8x4 piece of OBS was $84.
Out of
Used to
control.
be 15.
So it's pretty bleak out there, but I think that as more people keep moving to these red states, hopefully they will realize that the policies they left are what created the toxic situation that caused them to live miserable, horrible lives where they could not afford very much.
Hey guys, Michael Malice here. Wanted to tell you that today's episode is brought to you by Sheath Underwear. They make the most comfortable boxer briefs I have ever worn, and I'm currently wearing them right now. Is that TMI? Do they still say TMI? I don't know, I'm a booner. And a boomer. Leave that in. If you're sick of boxers that are too loose or briefs that are too tight, Sheath is for you. You don't chafe, you don't sweat, you're super comfortable and give you great support. And the amazing thing about Sheath underwear is their dual pouch technology that keeps your boy parts separated. First time you put it on, you're like, what is this? And then you can't live without it. Here's the other thing. If you go to sheathunderwear.com and use promo code MALICE20, you get 20% off your order. And they've got new materials that I've tried. The mesh I've tried, which are really even lighter. And the bamboo, I'm very excited to try and put around my junk. I've always wanted to put my junk around bamboo and call myself a panda. If you go to sheathunderwear.com and use promo code MALICE20, you get 20% off your order. And now let's get back to the beautiful and talented and intelligent Kristen Tate. Well, two things come to mind. I was talking to Ben Dominich, who runs the Federalist, you probably know, and I was while writing my upcoming book, I was reminding Ben of Reagan's speech in 1964, which launched his political career when he was endorsing Barry Goldwater, who was from Arizona, who was too radical for America. He had a huge landslide defeat, but basically launched the modern conservative movement. And Reagan gave this talk called A Time for Choosing. It was this big speech.
Most famous speech.
Yeah, and there was this one paragraph in it which was really, really moving, especially for someone like me who was born in the Soviet Union. And he was talking about a buddy of his was talking to a friend of his who was Cuban. And he goes, isn't it great that you got out of Cuba and came to America? He goes, wait, you don't understand. I had some place to go to. If you guys ruin this country, you don't have an America to go. This is the last hope for freedom on earth. And I think what you're talking about with Florida politics and these other states, what we're seeing on the right is, in some ways, and I hate to praise this person, is Karl Rove's 2004 strategy, which is, instead of reaching for the middle, let's rile up our base and get them animated and excited, and we'll win an election just by mainly...
That's what Trump did.
Right. Oh, very much so.
Yeah.
And I think if you see, instead of trying to persuade, you've been in New York enough. There's no talking to these people. They will never, ever see... And let me also make clear to people listening, this isn't like they're voting and they're voting for gay marriage, or that they're voting for like pro-choice initiatives. They're voting for the right for homeless people to literally set up tents on the sidewalk. Big what you will have in LA, I didn't realize this until recently, Skid Row is an expression. Now it's an entire neighborhood where you can't even walk because the entire go on Google Maps if you don't believe me. Google Skid Row. It's the entire street is tent after tent after tent with homeless people, many of whom are mentally ill, many of whom have drug problems, many of them who don't have bathrooms. And the official government policy that the police are enforcing is, you have to sit on your hands. We're not going to do anything about this. We will not prosecute.
They need to open up the national forest for them to go and start their own city. That's what they need to do.
So when we talk about, just quickly, when we talk about... I don't think a conversation is going to be fruitful. I think it has to be, what steps do we need to take to make sure you can't do anything to implement your demented ideas?
Yep. Although I would push back on that and say, I totally agree with you in terms of people who are in New York and San Francisco, but if someone hates their lives enough in these blue cities to actually leave, I do think you have some opportunity there to talk to those folks. The ones who are still in New York and California, forget about it. That's a waste of time. But if someone's life is miserable enough where they are willing to pack everything they own and pick up and uproot their family and move somewhere totally new and they've never been, totally different culture, I do think you can change the minds of those people. To your point on homelessness, this is definitely off topic for my book, but the homeless problem is out of control. I personally think they need to bring back insane asylums, and I mean that. I mean, there are several kinds of homeless people, right? You have to categorize them. There are the mentally ill, who literally are mentally ill. They need to go into some sort of hospital. Then there are criminals. Those people need to be in jail, okay? And then there are people who are honest people who have hit hard times. I would say that's a very small minority, like the people who would work if they could, but they just hit hard times. Those people, okay, we could talk about them. They probably have some sort of program that we can create where those people can get back into the workforce. But this idea that we're just going to let these three very distinct groups of people all get clumped together and live on the streets indefinitely, and we all just have to put up with that, and they can go around and assault people and commit crimes over and over and over again. It's mind-blowing to me that people will not only deal with this, but they will push for initiatives for it to keep happening. And part of the problem is that you have this class of people, particularly in California, who can afford to isolate themselves from these bad elements. They're not down on Skid Row. The people who are voting in favor of this nonsense, they never vote. The public could not even tell you, where Skid Row is. Of course, LA, most people never go downtown. They're all in the Palisades and whatever. But the people who say they support these initiatives, the people who put the Black Lives Matter signs in front of their townhouses, they never interact with the homeless folks. They never interact with diverse communities. They have no idea what the hell they're talking about. And these are the people who are forcing their virtues onto the most vulnerable, who are the poor working people who are just trying to get by and get their paychecks and go home, and now have to deal with trash on the ground, getting assaulted, being yelled at, and not feeling safe. It's just tragic, and I wish that we could take all these homeless people and just put them on the lawn in front of these people's houses who are voting in favor of this nonsense, because they are so out of touch. It reminds me, up in New Hampshire where my dad lives. My dad lives in not where I grew up. He's moved, and he now lives in a pretty well-to-do town of Wasps in New Hampshire, in the Hanover area, and they all have these crazy, ridiculous signs in their yards, like, in this house, we believe, Black Lives Matter, and whatever. It's all these bumper stickers listed on these stupid lawn signs in front of their nice, big, beautiful Victorian houses. These people have never seen a black person. The town is like 99.999% white, and the other, whatever remaining percentage is like Indian or something. Like, they've never seen a black person, they've never interacted with a homeless person, they have never actually come face to face with these problems they claim they're so passionate about. And these people are the problem with our society. It's not, black or white people, or, it's the upper middle class folks who live in these nice neighborhoods and never have to interact with the lowest elements of society that are burdened with low class working people. I can't think of side, which I hate to go to, with a few people who work in media, and I'm not a loud person, as anyone who knows me knows, as you know, it's pretty obvious. We're having a fun dinner, and this woman, she must have been 80, she was this typical Upper East Side T-word, and she comes over in her passive-aggressive way, starts lecturing one of the people next to me, and she's like, oh, were we too loud? Referring to herself sarcastically, and the guy was like, no. And she goes, oh, well, people should be more considerate of those around them. So instead of telling the waitress to tell us to keep it quiet, she decided to come over and have a confrontation. Well, she didn't realize she was talking to me. So then my friend goes, he goes, well, why are you saying this? She goes, oh, so that you can learn how I feel. And I go, I have learned, and I don't care. So now you can be free to leave. And she goes, well, she says something else. I go, listen, lady, you don't have that much time left. Why are you standing here talking to us when you should be getting the fuck out of here? And she goes, who knows who has more time left, you or me? And I go, the actuary. And everyone at the table was like, holy crap. And I'm like, not start fights you can't finish, you horrible old crone. But the point is, that mentality is applied to I agree with every step. That does not mean there should be tents covering downtown. That is a complete non sequitur. Here's another one. In the Upper West Side of Manhattan, it's the law
that fancy hotels have to take in homeless people.
I know, like the Empire Hotel.
Yeah. So these hotels, which are like $400 a night, are mandated to have homeless people inside them. And where people were complaining because the hotel was across the street from an elementary school, maybe high school, let's pretend I'm getting completely wrong, steel man the argument. They were yelling at the parents for not being more understanding of the homeless people who were shrieking at their school children.
Yep. You know, that was the Empire Hotel, which is across the street from an elementary school.
Okay.
Yeah, it was one of the hotels. I know there are several that got these contracts, but you know what's sick about it is the hotels actually love that setup because the city of New York and the state pay them more per night to house these homeless people than they get on the market. So the hotels want to have their cake and eat it too. They want to house all of these homeless people, but they don't want the public to know about it because they don't want the reputation of the hotel to be damaged. Like, you know, do you really want to stay at the Empire Hotel knowing like the night before a homeless dude was in the bed? No, of course not. So what these hotels are doing is they were trying to fill up all their rooms with these homeless people during COVID because the government would pay them way more than they were getting, you know, just from normal patrons. And they could fill them to capacity every night. So we taxpayers, or you taxpayers, because you're in New York, you were funding the bill for these crazy expensive hotels to be filled up with homeless people. And then the hotels would go to great lengths to make sure news media could not cover it and not actually list the names. They did not want the names of the hotels disclosed because they thought it would hurt their business.
And you know what else they did? They also lobbied successfully to make it hard to do Airbnb, to the point where I think something the rule is that you can't have an Airbnb unless you're living on the premises. So like if I had a New York City apartment building as an investment property and I'm renting it out, the hotel lobby made it so that you can't do that. So because that's competition for them. This is why I love talking to you, because as bad as it is, there's so many layers of malevolence when it comes to these kinds of situations.
And it's always like the honest working taxpayers who get totally screwed. You know, the very high earners, they don't care about all this. You know, it's like, what do they care? They can afford the taxes and whatever. It's the lower and middle income earners who are just doing the right thing and paying their taxes who get totally taken for a ride. And I can tell you, I want nothing to do with New York anymore. I still love it. I mean, I love the idea of New York.
The idea.
But yeah. And you know, there was a time when I wanted to move back there, but I want nothing to do with it anymore. Even just touching down in LaGuardia, it's like I'm all of a sudden depressed when I get there. It's like, this place sucks. I remember a story back in the Jenkins days. The cops would be at LaGuardia and they'd hand these pamphlets to everyone getting off the planes that said "Welcome to Fear City," and it would list all of the things that people should do when they visit New York to stay safe, because you know the crime was out of control. And I would argue we're even in a worse place than that now. I mean,
hey guys, Michael Malice here. Want to talk to you about our newest sponsor, Fume, F-U-M. Their website is fumessential.com. I really like this sponsor because it's a natural, non-addictive replacement for smoking, vaping, and nicotine addictions. And smoking is the worst thing for your health you might be doing. The problem with smoking is the ritual. What do you do with your hands if you're trying to quit smoking? Fume solves that. It's not a vape, it's not a cigarette, it's a hollow piece of Canadian maple wood with cores. It's got black pepper cores to help your nicotine cravings reduce, laughter for relaxation, you get it all. You go to fumessential.com and use promo code MALICE10. You get 10% off your entire order. You get no deliveries. You don't have to worry about your fume supply again. It looks really cool, and it helps you quit that horrible, horrible habit. Think of your teeth, extremely yellow teeth. Thanks to fumes, you don't have to worry about that. Go to fumessential.com and use promo code MALICE10, and you get 10% off your order and put into crypto. Let's get back to the show.
There's another element to this, which is I was very, very fortunate, as I've mentioned in your intro previously, like how loyal and like smart my fan base is. I don't like telling them that because then they'll get ideas that I have respect for them or even appreciation. But one of the things they do, like they'll send me contributions or things like that, and I'll buy a book or collectible, then I'll do a live stream about it. And now I'm at the point where I'm like, some of the things that they've got, I can't put on like Instagram or YouTube because I feel like I'm dangling raw meat in front of someone who's going to come to this house and rob it. Because if I go to Texas, at least I'll be able to have a camera system. I'll be able to have
a camera system. You're gonna have a gun.
Of course, I'm gonna have several guns. I'm gonna have, and an armory and things like that. Whereas here, I don't want to have to wonder if I leave this house for like 2 weeks to go to Russia or something like that. Is someone going to come? Am I going to come back? I gotta tell you though, in all fairness, I had a friend who visit me like a year ago, Jesse, and he's like, "Oh, you moved because the house is such a mess." Like, that's a mess. And he's like, "Oh, this move." No, this is how it always is. You have to step around. I don't like to live that fear that I'm going to come home and there's going to be a broken window or something like that. So that's another, and that is, as night follows day, that is going to come next. I was reading a biography of Murray Rothbard, or a book by him, and he just casually mentions that he lived in the Upper West Side, that everyone he knew at one point, their home was broken into. Sometimes when people were inside, like you and I and many others, don't think in those terms, like that's just something so terrifying, home invasion.
Oh, yeah.
But that was the norm, and they're doing everything in their power to drive the train towards that destination as fast as they can.
And you know what? When that becomes the reality, these woke idiots are going to be, totally on the side of the home invaders. Like, oh, imagine where they're coming from. They have nothing.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. But real quick, we do have the most loyal fans. Her whole family, I guess, went on a trip with my brother to the city of Austin, ironically enough. And he said they were all in the car talking about some podcasts that they love. I personally know you, like, you're super fans, and I know they listen to your podcast, so, hi Amber, Amber's family, like, I know they're listening to this.
And now trust the audience correctly. Not only that, you can tell them one of the things I'm going to frame when I move to Austin is Tom Shalhoub's cue card. I bring up the story every time you and I talk on air. Tom Shalhoub's cue card from the last episode of Red Eye. It was me, you, Lewis, and Anthony.
It never aired.
It never aired, but I got everyone to sign that cue card. It's gonna get framed and hung in the house, and your signature will be there. So absolutely.
You know why it never aired? Because Lewis said Asians have no soul.
Well, no. There's two things that happen. One is Trump on Syria. And you and I have done a lot of Fox to put in an earpiece. We don't even remember because literally no one has ever spoken in our earpieces. It's more for the host. And Louis Jacob Ness, who runs this network, repeatedly kept making a joke that because of like subscribers, Asians don't have souls. Then Anthony chimed in, then I chimed in. You're not a bunch of humorists. You're going to do yes and you hear the voice in your ear. Can you please stop saying that Asians don't have souls? So wait, Lewis. But it never aired. It was a really fun time. But it's also amazing how many we're gonna get inside baseball. How many powerhouses came out of that scene? You have Tim Dillon. You have Andrew Schultz, who moved to Miami. I'm gonna get. Oh my God! I just noticed that cute dog behind you.
Oh yeah.
Oh my God, what a scruffy little dog. What kind of dog? Is it a boy or a girl?
It's a boy. His name is Starbucks.
Oh my god, he's so cute! How old is he?
I've had him for a long time. He's
Oh my-
like 8.
Oh, leave me alone. I just want to sleep.
He's very demoralized right now. He has a bark collar on. 'Cause
Why? What happened?
He has a loud mouth.
Oh, does it work?
Neighbors. Yeah, it works.
Well, he went back to sleep. Oh my god. I was just at Kennedy's house yesterday playing with a French bulldog. He was very, very
Yeah,
cute.
he's really cute.
That's the other thing. If I go to Austin, I can get 2 dogs.
Yeah, that's right.
And
If you go to Austin, you will be eating barbecue all the time. You'll have a great life. You can walk your dog all around. You can actually get a townhouse. I mean,
it's going to be 2 dogs. It's going to be a German Shepherd named Rex and a pug named Buddy. And Buddy's always going to get Rex into trouble, even though Rex knows better. Because you know better than to follow along this little clown. What have I told you, Rex?
it sounds like a cartoon on the Cartoon Network or something.
They're going to have matching bandanas all the time.
Oh.
It's going to be really, really great. And I think sometimes one of them's going to get annoyed with the other. Although I don't think pugs are that rambunctious in terms of like being yappy and annoying. They're more like sedate.
Yeah, they're chill. They're chill dogs.
That's my. I might also get a Valhund, which is a Swedish version of the corgi. You probably haven't heard of it, but they're very yappy, so that's an issue. But now I know what to do. I'll get the little collar, just like.
Oh yeah, these things work like a charm.
Would they just shock them or something?
Yeah, I mean, it's not really a shock. It's like a strong, unpleasant vibration.
Okay, like the dog whisperer.
Yeah, exactly. But like once the dog knows the deal, like you just put it on and they won't bark, so they don't get shocked because they know it's on them, so they shut up immediately.
But after a while, dogs being not as smart as us, you could just have a regular collar and they'll think it's the shock collar.
That's a good idea. Although if they bark once and it doesn't stop them, then they'll know what's up.
Wait, so you're this is what a provincial New Yorker I am, okay? Because I think New Yorkers are so used to walking everywhere, we are completely oblivious to how gigantic this country is.
Texas is like its own
Exactly, I was
country.
gonna say, how far is Houston from Austin?
It's actually not that far. It's like 3 hours in the car.
How hard do you think it's gonna be for me to learn how to drive?
Have you actually never, ever been behind the wheel?
5 times.
It's not that hard. It's really, but Texas drivers are assholes. They're very aggressive.
But I own assholism.com.
Oh, okay. Go drive them.
Yeah, so, I mean, how long do you think it'll take me?
A week?
A week?
Yep.
Okay, that's what I was, because it's not that, it's just being more aware of your surroundings and walls to match the stuff, because I have some comic book art, right? So comic book art is black and white, and it's later colorized.
I mean, I haven't been there since COVID, but like, yeah, you could like get some diseases just by like being on the street there. Like,
People were fighting. It felt very on edge, which I was not
oh,
expecting.
interesting. When I went there, it was just like a lot of smelly people partying in very close proximity.
Okay. Yeah, but I'm being told South Beach is not representative, but like the rest of it didn't seem that appealing to me either.
World star. Yeah, no, it's Miami. A crazy scene. Didn't they just? I think in Miami though, they just had all these crazy riots going on. Remember that a couple weeks ago?
The day I left,
Where they were like all twerking on the cop cars and stuff.
the day I left Miami, there was a fist fight with like 5 people in the airport. like
Oh,
two
you
gates.
saw that?
No, but it was the same day.
Oh, okay,
Yeah,
yeah.
like 2 gates down from me,
Right,
and that just happened today.
That urban decay.
And it just happened again today.
Oh my god.
How are people getting in fist fights at the airport and not taking out the TSA? But that's between you and me.
This whole society is going down the tubes rapidly. Like, even since the last time I came on your show, I feel that American society is becoming a heap of garbage. And part of the reason why is because politics is infused in everything now. Everything.
I think we're going to have a national divorce. I've been arguing for this for 4 years.
Oh, I would love that.
Yeah.
But you know what? The leftists don't want a national divorce because they need our money. They need to keep taxing us to fund all their bullshit because none of the people who, vote for them work.
Yeah, I'm not saying no divorce is easy. It's not going to be like Bill and Melinda Gates. But at a certain point, it's like, what are you going to do about it? And I think I just was on Buck Sexton's show, and he laughed, but I'm like, and this is not to disrespect Buck. I mean, he was just, I think, kind of surprised at what I said. I'm like, look, if we have it that everyone is discussing defunding the police and having an issue on this, why aren't the Republicans putting forth a bill to expel California from the Union?
Because they're cowards.
No, but my point is, that would be, even if it doesn't go anywhere, let's have everyone clutching their pearls and freaking out on the Democratic side instead of people in Oklahoma having to discuss defunding the police. I'm for abolishing the police.
This is the problem with the right. They just let the left incrementally change society. It happens in increments, right? I mean, a year ago, the idea of funding the police would have sounded insane, and now here we all are having serious discussions about this because we have let them move the goalposts incrementally, and every day they move it a little bit, we don't notice, and then before you know it, the goalpost is all the way over there, and we're all talking about defunding the police. It's ridiculous. And everyone's too scared to fight back. I mean, I shouldn't talk about it. I shouldn't be talking because even I don't really engage in some of these culture wars either because people online, they dox you, they try to ruin your life. I mean, it's really scary what this mob is. Twitter is like a mob in search of a victim. And anyone who says anything that doesn't fully agree with their agenda, they come after. You are one of the few people who is willing to just say it like it is. I mean, I'm serious. That's why everyone loves your Twitter feed so much. But these people are changing our society for the worse, and the last year has happened rapidly. They seized on COVID. They seized on George Floyd. They are disingenuous. They are not having arguments in good faith. And I don't know where this will all end, but I can tell you it's not going to end well.
God damn it.
I think it is going to end well. I think my next book after The Anarchist Handbook, The White Pill, is going to be about how the good guys won and how they're going to win again.
So, in 2 sentences.
I'm not spoiling my book.
Okay, all right.
Maybe off camera.
I think China is going to conquer us, or we're going to just become a failed Latin state like Brazil.
China just, okay, this is a whole long separate conversation. I'm not saying China's not a concern. Obviously, I did a book on North Korea. My level of animosity towards the Chinese government is without question and without limit. But I do not think I'm more like they can conquer us via the New York Times, but I don't think the New York Times is unstoppable. Is my point. What are you working on now? Are you working on a 4th book?
No. So I actually just joined a big statewide political race in Texas in an executive role. It might be announced by the time this episode comes out, but it's going to make national news when it's announced, and it's very exciting. So I've been really busy with that, and that's kind of what I've got going on right now. So can't talk about it too much right now, but it's very exciting. I think Texas is worth saving, and there are a lot of issues where we can lead the nation down here, whether it's taxes or, even defending our borders, being a state that exerts its influence and fights back against the federal government. There's just so much room for leadership down here. So I'm on a big statewide race down here. It'll be announced soon, and it's been taking up all my time. So no books in the works right now.
But and let's look at how that happened. If you look at Obamacare, that was because of Massachusetts and what Mitt Romney did there. But you also look at drug decriminalization, that started out of Colorado, which was just basically blatant, and still is, blatant defiance of federal law, being like, we're going to legalize it, come and raid us. And they did. They did raid Colorado, they did raid California. At a certain point, they're like, all right, we don't have the will for this. So there is an enormous capacity, especially with a state with just, I've sounded like a Texan already, just shoot me now.
Yeah, you're going to fit in right down here.
And everything's big in Texas except for my state. But the one of the things I do like about Texans is this enormous sense, maybe it's phony, I don't know, I can't speak on that yet, of defiance.
Oh, it is not phony. That is 100% right. And it's awesome. It's such a badass place. Like, you come down here, at least for me, I came down here and I feel like I'm just in a totally different country, you know?
There is a huge crew of us in Austin who are just waiting to be friends with you. So you will have, I'm serious though, but I mean, that's one of the reasons I'm moving is because I have I've said this before and I'll say it to you because I know it'll mean something to you. Moving is, especially after living somewhere for your whole life, it's an emotional thing. It's also a complicated thing. And my friends down there are such badasses that they preemptively told me, like, they're going to make sure that there's no reason I can't do it. So one of them is like, I've got a lot of books, right? One of them said, I will come to your house and pack all your books myself. So and he means it. I know he means it. Another one, and this actually seems like something I would do for fun, is like, I'll go look around the houses for you, and I'll give you an honest report what I'd like, what I like. I'm like, that just sounds like fun if you go shopping without having to spend the thing and having a realtor. So there's no excuses left, and frankly, at this point, I don't need excuses. At this point, it's just it's done. I feel at this point that they're screwing with us on purpose and are making things worse just because they can. Like, I know that's like crackpot, like tinfoil hat thinking.
I agree.
It's indistinguishable.
I agree, Mike.
They're open about it. They have a seething hatred for working people.
You're right.
They have a seething hatred for private industry and a seething hatred for anyone or anything that questions government.
I wonder if I could actually.
So they're open about it. I don't think that's conspiracy theory talk at all. I really don't. And you know, it's really interesting. We've seen like a total swap in terms of like the paradigms of these parties. Like I think back, at least when I was a kid, it was the leftists who would always question things and be more skeptical and sort of be more free thinkers, and they were more likely to kind of have those inclinations. And now those are the biggest sheep. It's the leftists. They just, whatever the government tells them, they love getting pat on the head and, you know, given a cookie and just taking whatever the government
literally a
tells
cookie
them as
now.
fact. And it's dangerous. I mean, that is, you know, these people call themselves anti-fascists. They are the biggest fascists among us. It's really scary, and these ideas, I call it the unopposable ideas, like these ideas of like diversity, inclusiveness. They've created these ideas that you cannot oppose, right? Because who would be against diversity? Who would be against being inclusive?
Who would be against helping the homeless? I'm not against it.
Exactly. They've created unopposable ideas, and that's what's caused these ideas to spread like wildfire. Why these corporations are like Delta, and you know, these corporations that have nothing to do with politics are now big political organizations essentially, and it's what's rotting the country. It's so powerful what they've created with language and ideas, and it's the right wingers now who are the ones who are willing to question and willing to, you know, not just take the line from the government all the time without any pushback at all. So I love that rebel spirit, that streak that you find more on the right and within libertarians, and I find that to be much more prevalent down here in Texas, especially than where you are up in New York. So, if there's one place where freedom can survive, it's definitely Texas.
Do you have a big crew in Houston?
Yeah, I do. Houston's pretty awesome. So Houston, like I said, it's an aesthetically kind of ugly city. Like you get here and it's a lot of like strip malls. Austin's way cooler in terms of just it's a prettier city. But Houston is kind of an armpit, but it's also very I don't know how you, it's very, I don't want to use the word diverse because that's a left-wing word, but there are so many different kinds of people here. There's so much industry here. There's capital here. You meet people from everywhere. The food is just unbelievable. The museum, it's just such a cultured metropolitan city, and it really caught me off guard when I first moved here, but it's fantastic. I love the people. Dallas is great too. I mean, I'm sure you'll spend time up there when you come to Texas, but like each city in Texas kind of has its own personality. Like Austin is like the annoying, like liberal sibling. Houston's kind of like the oldest sibling who has like an established career going. Dallas is like the preppy, snobby sibling. Like it's kind of like siblings in a family. But they're all cool. They all have their own personalities, and you'll love it. It's really awesome. But I will say, the thing I was the most disappointed about when I moved down here is there are no cowboy hats. And like nobody, I thought I'd get down here and it was gonna be like everyone would be wearing cowboy hats and boots with the accent. But apparently that's a West Texas thing, so.
Well, you're not going to find Brooklyn accents anymore either, so, I mean.
They're becoming more common down here.
Yeah.
That's on move.
Tate, we're running out of time. What has been your favorite part of this interview?
I think imagining you driving a car, like, I'm trying to think, I think you should get like one of those monster pickup trucks, like an F-350. The next time I see you,
I'll get a Land Cruiser,
pull up
and then you can actually go somewhere.
F-350.
Ask Joe Rogan about his Land Cruiser. That's what you need to get.
All the fixins. Like I want, like.
I'm gonna get a truck that turns into a dinosaur and eats other trucks.
Oh yeah, that would be very on brand.
Sharkosaurus. No, actually, I was talking to my friends and they were screaming at me. Literally screaming in Miami about what kind of car to get, and they were insisting I should get a Toyota Camry. And I'm like, I don't like that because my dad had that. And I thought, well, people disrespect me. And then I asked my other car friends, they go, no one's going to judge you. It's not like with clothes. Like, it's like, Toyota Camry is perfectly respectable. But what we settled on was me getting some kind of coupe, which are kind of these, like, it's the four-door, but there's only four seats, but only two doors. So they look a little cooler than a regular car, but they're still reliable and so on and so forth. Is that approved?
I guess. I know nothing about cars.
No.
So, as long as it has a four wheels and moves, I'm good with it. I think I get the cheapest thing that's like reliable. So, but I'm very bad. Don't come to me for car advice. You'll be driving a lemon.
You are welcome. Hey guys, before we go, if you enjoyed this podcast, you might enjoy some of the other podcasts available at gasdigitalnetwork.com. This week, we're highlighting the Gasta Show with host, lead singer from the band Hate Breed, Jamie Gasta. You can find the full catalog of episodes on demand at gasdigitalnetwork.com or catch the latest 15 episodes anywhere you can find podcasts. Here's a clip.
Great time hanging out with Jimmy Bauer once when I met him, and we got fucking handcuffed and sat on a curb outside of a bar together. That was great.
Why?
He was like talking to some girl for some Peterson show. I've never met him, by the way. He's like in the back room, just like being Jimmy Bauer. And she's like, let's go to the bar. That's not good. I'm like, okay, I'm not gonna miss the opportunity to watch Jimmy Bauer. So we walk to this bar, like near the venue. He gets fucking hammered, starts hitting on a girl. The girl's boyfriend like kind of says something to her, like super offensive, she slaps him, his fake teeth come out, and she fucking steps on him. So he like goes full like raging mad and starts just like pushing the boyfriend and like just screaming, and so they called the cops and me and Jim Bauer got handcuffed and sat outside, and then they just let us go. But I never saw him again either.
Oh my God. That's incredible. That's Mr. Dead. Alright, who are we going to shift to next? Maybe a little Lex. I haven't listened to Lex in a while.
Following is a conversation with John.
Hello. If you have found the ideas I discuss interesting and useful, perhaps you might consider purchasing my recently released book, Beyond Order, 12 More Rules for Life, available from Penguin Random House in print or audio format. You can use the links we provide below or buy through Amazon or at your local bookstore. This new book, Beyond Order, provides what I hope is a productive and interesting walk through ideas that are both philosophically and sometimes spiritually meaningful, as well as being immediately implementable and practical. The concepts that I developed in my previous books, 12 Rules for Life, and before that, Maps of Meaning. Thanks for listening. And enjoy the podcast. I'm pleased today to be talking to Dr. Ian McGilchrist. I met him in 2018 in London, and we had the good fortune to have a relatively brief conversation, which was taped and put on YouTube, and it was very productive. And so now I get to talk to him again, and hopefully for a longer period of time. Ian is a psychiatrist. Dr. McGilchrist is a psychiatrist, a former fellow of All Souls College, Oxford, an associate fellow of the Green Temple College, Oxford. He's lectured all over the world. He's published a number of scientific papers. He's most well known for his book, The Master and His Emissary, and I think you have a copy of that. I asked you to get that so that you could show people The Master and His Emissary, The Divided Brain in the Making of the Western World, which is an analysis of hemispheric specialization and its philosophical and scientific significance. And working on this book, which I have started to read, called The Matter of Things, which will be forthcoming at some point in the future and will shape some of our discussion today. He's published broadly, scientifically and publicly, study of paintings of subjects with psychotic illnesses. That's coming out, I believe.
I'm planning that.
And a series, and also forthcoming, a series of essays about culture and the brain. So, welcome. Thank you very much for agreeing to talk to me.
That's a huge pleasure, Wilson. Thank you very much.
So, one of the things, I was rereading the introduction to your new book this morning, and I was struck by many different topics, but I was particularly interested in your conception of attention. And so you talk about attention as something that in some sense brings things into being. I think that's a misreading of your writing. And maybe I could get you to expound on that a bit and to tell me what you think attention is, because I've had a hell of a time differentiating it from context and try to explain it. It falls apart in your grasp. So
I think
what we say that attention is
still there, but
the way in which it's a disposition of one's consciousness. So attention is how you dispose your consciousness towards the world. When I discovered, when I was researching The Master and His Emissary,
let's mark where these screws can go.
I came across this fascinating thing that one of the most fundamental differences between the hemispheres is their way of attending. And it didn't entirely hit me at the time how important it is. But we can talk about that later. You were asking a rather sort of interesting philosophical question about how attention helps to bring things into being. And I think it does, both generally and rather in a very good sense, in the level generally what I mean is that how you attend to the world. And on that depends on the world you find. The qualities of the world that come to your attention is determined by the quality of the attention you bring to it. And
all right.
So that's a very significant statement. I was talking to someone the other day who's somewhat theologically minded. He was also very interested in the role that attention played in constituting the world. I mean, you pay attention to things that you value, one way or another. And what that means is that the world tends to manifest itself in relationship to your value structure. And that's a very troublesome idea, in some sense, with regards to our conceptions of the objective world, because it's not easy to parse out what's objective when what manifests itself to you is dependent in large part on what you value. It's very complicated to sort that all out.
Well, possibly very much later we can come to the question of what objective and subjective mean and how one can. I think it's a mistaken dichotomy. I think one can interpret the words in important ways that give them meaning. But I think to think of it as just being an objective world out there and a subjective world in here is one of the problems of modern Western philosophy. But to come back to the creation of the world, I was going to say that not only does it sort of bring into the world that you know, which is after all by definition the only world you will ever know, but it also changes who you are. So the quality of the attention you pay changes you, the attender. So it's a very profound difference. And in the first book, The Master and His Emissary, one of the things I was expounding was how this business of attention creates a whole distinct world. So the hemispheres have evolved to two different sets of values. You mentioned values, and it's very germane. They have different reasons for existing, and therefore have different things they respond to. And what I have tried to explain in that book is that this gives rise to a whole way of seeing the whole world. It's not just individual, but also at times it becomes the way of looking at the world for a whole culture. Because of course we're, as individuals, never entirely distinct from our culture. We're partly created by our culture and make it what it is. So it's a very fundamental thing.
Well, you take pains in the idea,
That's what it
or to
should
call
be.
attention to the idea, that something extremely mysterious is going on in relationship to hemispheric specialization. So it's a very ancient phenomenon. Many creatures, or most creatures with developed nervous systems, have a bifurcated brain. And the hemispheres differ substantially in terms of their neuroanatomical structure. And the question arises, why is it necessary, assuming that that differentiation of structure reflects some profound differentiation of function, why is it necessary to look at the world, so to speak, in two ways? And why is it so necessary that that
How's that possible?
bifurcation is conserved across
Go all the
evolutionary
way
history?
down.
You'd think that one way would be sufficient, but it doesn't seem to be. And so the first question is, why do you have to look at the world in two ways? And the next question might be, well, what are those two ways? One of the things you outlined that particularly fascinating to me is that the right hemisphere seems to be specialized more for what you don't know, whereas the left hemisphere is specialized more for what you do know. And I've sort of defined knowing pragmatically. You know something if you undertake an action and the outcome is what you specify. And you don't know something if you undertake an action and the outcome is other than what you specify. And that sort of reflects that novelty victorization division that was Goldberg, I believe, that originated that the neuropsychologist.
Well, Jordan, you've raised a whole bunch of points there, so I need a little bit of time to explain that. First of all, every neural network that we know of is asymmetrical. Going down to the very most basic network that we know, and the most ancient one that we know. Nematostella vectensis, a sea anemone that is 700 million years old, is already asymmetrical in its neural network, and that's the earliest neural network we know of. And it's true of insects, it's true of worms, it's true of all the rest. And the three questions that really got me going on this was, if the brain is there for making connections, and its power is largely lies in the connections it can make, why is it divided down the middle? Mockingly divided, and most people don't realise about how this differentiation is. They haven't actually seen a brain. The second thing is, why is it asymmetrical? Because if you just need to grow this brain, you grow it symmetrically. The skull that contains it is symmetrical. And the third thing is, why is the connection, the principal connection between the two hemispheres, the base of the hemisphere, the corpus callosum, why is it at least as much, if not more, in the service of inhibition than facilitation? So it's as though there's something really important about keeping two things apart. Now, my hypothesis, and it's just that, is that this results from something that all creatures need to do. All creatures, without exception, need to eat and not be eaten. They need to live and to manipulate their environment, to get food, to catch something, to pick something up quickly, deftly, pick a twig, build a nest. In other words, for all the kind of day-to-day stuff, food, shelter, they need to manipulate the world very precisely. But at the same time, they must pay a precisely opposite kind of attention, which is sustained, vigilant, open without presupposition as to what it may find. And so, on the whole, the way in which this has been addressed by evolution is that there are two neuronal massives that can direct attention of the world, and the left hemisphere tends to specialize in targeted, precise attention, and the right hemisphere in a much broader, vigilant kind of attention, which actually sustains the being of the world. Nothing about these tiny fragments that are isolated, disconnected, meaningless, gives you any idea of their meaning. It's only when you see the broad picture and you understand that they're not actually things that are going to be put together to make that broad picture. They're things that are isolated out of an already connected picture. So that's the basis there. I just wanted to pick up your thing about, because I don't think it's quite right to say that the left hemisphere is about what we know and the right is about what we don't know. Somebody, I can't remember who, some philosophers said that knowledge is what we're uncertain of. Things we're certain of are things that we don't really know properly. I think this could be the truth. So the left hemisphere tends to jump to conclusions. It's much more quick and dirty than the right hemisphere. The right hemisphere is the one that says, hang on, wait a moment, you may be getting this wrong. Because it wants to get things quickly. Its job is to manipulate, its job is to get, it's to catch, it's to grab stuff. It's the one that controls the right hand that does all the grabbing. So the left hemisphere tends to prize certainty, and it's very uncomfortable when there's ambivalence. Whereas the right hemisphere
can't act.
Exactly. Whereas the right hemisphere seems to appreciate the possibility that we have to hold multiple views, multiple possibilities together. So it has a quite different take on reality. It's more interested in discovery and exploration rather than capture. The left hand's more interested in capturing a thing that it thinks it knows, often not in any deep way. It's just identified an object it needs. But to understand things, the right hemisphere is better. And the idea of the master and the emissary is I won't go through the myth of that, I've explained it so many times, but the basic idea is that the master, the right hemisphere, knows that it needs an emissary to do the sort of functional administration work. So it's aware that the stuff that it mustn't get involved with and that it can't know. Whereas the left hemisphere knows everything, as it were, in its eyes, because it only knows a tiny bit, which is explicit. And, there it is, in broad daylight, down in black and white, no shades of meaning, no nuances, nothing implicit about it. So it thinks it knows it. And if you like, the downfall of the left hemisphere, and therefore I would go with society, civilization, as it once was, that we belong to, is that the left hemisphere doesn't know what it is it doesn't know. It's the famous thing, the Dunning-Kruger effect. The more you know, the more you think you don't know, and the people who know least think they know everything. It's a little, that's not quite fair, but there's something of that about it, yeah. But can I pick up something that I touched on earlier? We were talking about creating the world through attention, and I think that is true. And there's a very big question there about what I mean by that. Do I mean just, as you say, subjectively or objectively? Maybe we should park that for the moment, but I don't mean either in a very simple way. But what is fascinating is that the right hemisphere, as I say, knows that there are things that it's not aware of. But the left hemisphere seems to take the attitude that if it's not attending to it, it doesn't exist. This is very dramatic in clinical neurology. So people who've had a right hemisphere stroke, they not only, as it were, don't now pay attention to something, but they deny that that thing ever existed. There's wonderful, very rich accounts of patients. One of the ones that I really like is an experiment done by, who was it, Viziat and Luxati, I think, back in the late 1970s, where they got a couple of highly educated people with right hemisphere stroke. And it was in Milan at the time, and they said, these people lived in Milan. And they said, imagine you're standing in the Piazza del Duomo in front of the cathedral and looking at the square. Describe all the buildings in the square. And they would describe only the ones on the right side that the left hemisphere only pays attention to. Whereas, but I need to say to the viewers, that the right hemisphere pays attention to both parts of the world. So when you have a left hemisphere stroke, the world is relatively preserved globally. But after a right hemisphere stroke, you're only relying on this left hemisphere. It's interested in the bit of space which it can manipulate, a bit on the right. So they named the buildings down the right-hand side of the view of the square they had then. And then the experimenters asked them to go to the other end of the square and look at the cathedral facade and name the buildings. And this time they named all the ones down the other side of the square, but didn't mention any of the ones they'd just mentioned. So there's something, it's been commented by one philosopher, that it's almost like it's an ontological landslide. Things come in and out of existence for the left hemisphere. And when it was pointed out to these people what they'd missed, they became angry, irritable, and frustrated, which is a typical left hemisphere emotional term. Impatient to dismiss this. So I think that's intriguing, and it's just one image. I mean, the very dramatic one is to do with denying that you have parts of the body. And as was pointed out by it's Lamela, I think, way back in the second decade of the 20th century, they don't only deny after a right hemisphere stroke that they have the left half of the body, which is not functional as the right hemisphere stroke. They will become very irritable if questions are asked about it, or they will just go blank. I mean, they will be talking perfectly coherently, and they're asked about that, they'll go boom, or they will become very irritated. And if you force them to recognize that they have a body on that side, although they're perfectly intelligent people, they know they must always have had a left half of their body, they will deny it. And he says it's as though they never had a left half of the body. It's not only that it's not there now, it never was for them and never will be. And that's what I mean when I say that there are different levels of creativity of the world, the creation of the world through attention, I should say, in the two hemispheres.
Now, you're, in your new book, and to some degree in the Master of this Emissary, you're also you're mixing your neurological analysis with philosophical speculation. You're trying to solve a problem. So maybe you could tell us what the problem is, and then we can discuss the solution.
Well, I suppose the problem is, well, as I mentioned, that there was a puzzle about why brains are set up in this rather odd way.
But you're also pointing to a kind of philosophical malaise, right? So there's a conceptual problem, but also an emotional or broad-scale philosophical problem. And
there is indeed, and indeed, if I may say so, the book that I hope will come out very soon called The Matter with Things, which is a pun on several levels, because I think it's a critique not only of the way we think now, but of our obsession with thinking of the world as composed of things, that only matter exists. But anyway, in that book, what I'm really trying to do is marry science and philosophy again. They never should have been separated. Science cannot properly be done by philosophy, without philosophy. Many scientists and philosophers have commented on this over the years, and the divorce has been disastrous for them both. You get a mindless kind of science that jumps to very naive conclusions that everything is mechanical. And you get a kind of philosophy that thinks it's above dirtying its hands with science. Now I think each of these parties can benefit from a rapprochement, which is long overdue. And it's that I try to do in this very big book, to show how strands of neurology, philosophy and physics, and even of world mythologies come together to show the same, very similar pictures, the same gestalt, the same differences between a world such as the world brought into being by the left hemisphere and a world such as is brought into being by the right hemisphere. And perhaps before going on any further, you did invite me earlier to say something about what those differences are. Well, to try and sum it up very quickly, what I say is for the left hemisphere, things are known, familiar. Literally things that are unfamiliar are better dealt with by the right hemisphere until the left hemisphere can go, oh, I see, it's one of those, put it in a category ones. They're more distinct, in fact they're probably entirely fragmentary or isolated in the left hemisphere, whereas the right hemisphere sees that nothing is ever ultimately unconnected from everything else. Things in the left hemisphere are frozen, they don't move, they don't change. Things in the right hemisphere are constantly flowing and changing, although flowing and changing and remaining the same are not necessarily an opposition. As we know, Heraclitus, my favourite philosopher, said, by changing it remains the same, which is the image of a river, which is never ever still for a moment. That the river outside my house that was there at breakfast time is probably there now. So in that sense it's remained, and we're all, I believe, like these rivers, all living beings. In fact, probably everything that exists is, as Heraclitus pointed out. So what other things? The left hemisphere abstracts. It tends to abstract from the body. It tends to abstract from the context. Something I learned very early on in life is the importance of context. How it utterly changes anything that somebody says or any image. And this is particularly true, of course, in literature, which I studied and taught for a certain while when I was a young man. That once you start paraphrasing a poem and taking its sentiments out of the context, they've utterly changed themselves. They're no longer what they were. The left hemisphere is more interested in categories, the right hemisphere in the unique case. So it sees that you're not just a member of a certain group, you tick certain boxes, you fall into that category, but that you're massively complicatedly different. And I mean, this has a very real basis, when you look at neurological patients. People who have right hemisphere strokes are examples. Two I know of that don't come from the same research group in Switzerland, but involve a farmer who used to know all his cows by name. And after the right hemisphere, right parietal stroke, he couldn't really, well, he not only couldn't tell his cows one from another, he could hardly tell a cow from a horse. And another one who very plaintively commented after right hemisphere stroke, she spent her whole life studying the birds of Switzerland. She was an authority on them. And she said all the birds were the same. So that's what happens in the left hemisphere world. Quality is replaced by quantity. Uniqueness is replaced by category. And then again, the left hemisphere tends to see things as inanimate, where the right hemisphere will see them as animate.
Well, a category implies, in some sense, that the members of that category are indistinguishable, right? Because otherwise you don't have a category, you just have particularity. So you can imagine that, I mean, to understand this completely, you have to understand to some degree what categories are for, or what categories are for. At least in part, you put things that you can act towards the same way in the same category. And so young children might think of cats and dogs as dogs, all of them as dogs, because they're cuddly, pettable entities. Not because they have 4 legs or because they have fur, but because you interact with them the same way. And then you can differentiate cats and dogs as you get a little older. But the first category, dog, which is pettable things, is a perfectly reasonable category. You can imagine that once a categorical structure has been imposed, that it's easy just to see the category. I wrote an essay in my new book, which is called Beyond Order, about the function of artists. And I believe that part of what artists do, and I think this is maybe, you can tell me, but I think it might reflect the differences that you're talking about. When I was a kid, I lived in a small town. I can remember all the houses on my block. I can remember, they're familiar to me as individual entities. But now that I'm an adult, I've lived on this street for like 20 years, but the houses are indistinguishable to me. I can't see them as different entities. And I think it's because I'm so familiar with the category house, which is a practical category, that I can't see beyond the category. And it's very efficient because I know what houses do. They sit there. You don't have to pay attention to them. And so it's really a useful perceptual shorthand just to see the category. And what an artist will do is take you outside the category and make you see the particulars again that you're missing. And I guess that's partly the context, to remind you of what's beyond what your memory forces you now to see. Is that akin to this distinction that you're making between the left and the right?
Well, it is a distinction. It's a related distinction, but not exactly the same distinction. I mean, interestingly, it relates to the difference, a very important difference, in fact I think probably the single most important difference of all, which doesn't at first strike people, partly because they're so used to living in a world of representations, that it's the distinction between the presencing of something as it comes into being for you, and your representation of it, like a caricature or a category thing or a verbiage sign. So that the left hemisphere's addiction, if you like, to understanding things via language is very important, because after all, language makes everything the same. You know, as Nietzsche said, it makes the uncommon common. Because, you know, when you say somebody's got brown hair or something, then you've got everything just like in a category. But when you see that person, there's something quite different about the way their hair is and so forth. So
you find that out if you painted, you know, because you wouldn't paint it with brown paint. You'd paint it with a multitude of colors if you were really looking at it.
You certainly would.
And you'd see that it wasn't brown. And I mean, artists play with them. Was it Manet who painted the haystacks? Or Monet, I don't remember. At multiple different times of the year. And the haystack, I mean, the shape was the same, but the haystack was completely different. And that's really, that's what he was portraying, was the category haystack, but the reality is extraordinarily complex. But the category seems to have functional significance. So you dump things together that you can act towards the same way. And then a word is labeled on top of that to serve as an even further compressed shorthand for that category. So a complex world that's multitudinous and too complex to even see. And then there's a perceptual act that categorizes that into a perceptual image, house, say, and then there's a further compression and eradication of information that enables that to be represented by a word. Now,
well, the Greek philologist Max Müller said it's interesting that we read encyclopedias, we have dictionaries, we read books, and we are with all these words, but none of the things that these words represent actually exist, because in the act of being represented, they are no longer the thing that was present. The very fact of representing it suddenly stops the presence of the thing. To me, this is very vivid in Wordsworth, and this comes back to some of the things you were saying about the liveliness of the childhood mind. That when he was a young man, and particularly as a boy, rambling in the Lake District, the world was very much still alive to him and coming into being for him. But that as a man, he went back there, and as it were, couldn't avoid seeing the landscape as, oh, a picturesque mountain, a picturesque lake, one of those, if you like. And this is what he means by the phrase, the shades of the prison house growing round the growing, closing round the growing boy, in his intimations of immortality on the
yes, so
childhood.
So this is from this book. There was a time when meadow, grove, and stream, the earth and every common sight, to me did seem apparelled in celestial light, glory and the freshness of the dream.
Yes. That's it. This is what I'm referring to, and this really is one of the more important differences. I would say probably the core difference. That, as it were, one world is real, vibrant, unknown in part, only known ever to a degree, and ever more coming into being and ever more coming into knowledge for the right hemisphere. And for the left hemisphere, already cold, finished, known, dead, put in a book, stuffed on the shelf, filed away. And we now live so much in this virtual, represented world, partly because we're very much cut off from nature, which constantly reminds you of its vivid, uncertain liveliness, confronts you with its audacious beauty and vitality all the time. Partly because we've learned to cut our minds off from our bodies, and so we think in this enormously abstract way. And partly because of city life, partly because of technology, which means we interact with two-dimensional screens rather than the three-dimensional depth, which is in the room when you're with someone, which is why, as you know, and I know, because we both help patients in our time, that it's very important to be in the room with the patient. It's a completely different thing that happens from anything you can do on the telephone or even like this.
So part of the philosophical case that we're making is, I believe, that, well, we have a terrible conundrum as human beings. We need in some sense, for the purposes of efficiency, to move towards the most efficient representations possible. And this has real bearing on the nature of perception itself. So I know, for example, that even in the primary visual cortex, so in principle, you know this, but I'm going to explain it for people who are listening. As the pattern signals from your retina move back towards your brain, they move upwards, so to speak, through a hierarchy of processing units. And even at the first stages of that processing, there's still more top-down input from other brain centers than there is input from the retinal structures themselves. And so what that implies is that even at the beginnings of perception, you know, if you think about it as being built up from perceptual elements up towards the whole gestalt, which isn't exactly accurate, but it'll do for now, even at the beginnings of the visual process, there's more input from what's inside than there is from the external world, so to speak, or at least as much. And then what seems to happen as we age is that increasingly that perception becomes solipsistic. And so we're only seeing what we know, and that's extraordinarily efficient because it's very hard to build up a new perception. You have to really investigate something in detail to see it anew. Whereas if it's the same old thing that you've seen 10,000 times, you can already use what you know. And it's not surprising you'd be annoyed if you were forced to jump out of that, because there's a tremendous amount of work that has to be done if you want to see something for the first time again.
Well, as we both know, people would rather deny obvious truths than let go of a cherished belief. So that's certainly right. And we don't perceive the world as, in a naive way. We come to the world with our history, with our vast range of experience, and so as you say, this top-down effects on the lower end of things, the lower end of perception from higher cognitive functions. But that's an image of something very important to the philosophy I try to put across in the matter with things, which is that in order to understand any element in experience, it's important to see what wholes it goes to make up, or potentially can go to make up, as it is to see what it turns into when you break it down. In fact, often it's not very revealing to find out what happens when you break it down. And so in a way,
psychology suffers from that. Psychology is a discipline that consists, at least in its present form, mostly of disparate experiments which demonstrate very particular things about people, about how people behave in very particular circumstances. But there's very little that unites that back up to something that isn't merely fragmentary observation. And so it's very difficult to get a grip on. And there's billions of potential separate observations, and they're not that helpful in some sense.
Well, it's all part of the world picture, which, from a philosophical point of view, is the purpose of the long book, which I sent to you in manuscript, The Matter of Things. Effectively, I can say quite simply that I want to give a considered response to the philosophy of our age, which is that there is only matter and that things are understood by reducing them to their parts, and this doesn't change them. It's a very naive philosophy. It's simplistic and it's immoral because it changes the way we treat the world and other people and nature. It changes our idea of who we are in a very damaging way, ruling out things that other traditions have traditionally held very powerful. And coming back to your comment about how people cling on to things that they believe in, it's much more difficult to try and see something in a different way, especially with age. This is why, of course, most traditions of spiritual growth enjoin on the person paradoxes, to see things in a completely new way that violates all the ways that they thought they knew. So I use paradox in this new book, but not in some blind way. In fact, I showed that what we mean by a paradox is that the view of the left hemisphere of something and the view taken of the right hemisphere of the same thing can never actually completely marry up. they have different qualities, and if you push the comparison or the desire to make them logically come together too far, you end up with a paradox. And this started happening, early on in the Greek, the ancient Greek period of philosophy with Zeno. This is where the first paradoxes come from, and I have a whole chapter on paradox, which I see as generated by the desire of the left hemisphere to say it must be this or it must be that, clinging on preferentially to the very fragmentary view of the left hemisphere. See, the left hemisphere is not good at understanding. That sounds a very blanket statement, and it is. But the whole of the first part of that book, the new book, is massively more thorough neuropsychology than is in the Masterman's Emissary. So it's about as thorough as I could possibly make it. And what I do is I look at the ways in which we have any chance of getting an idea of what the world is. What are the portals of entry of, if you like, information about the world to us? And I take it that it depends very much on our attention, how we dispose our attention, perception, the judgments we form on the basis of perception, the ways in which we apprehend what we're dealing with rather than comprehend it, in other words, grasp it, as we say, with the right hand of the left hemisphere, take it, use it. How we understand it in terms of emotional intelligence, which is not a small thing. It's the whole way in which we understand everything human. By emotional, I don't mean sort of in some, you know what I mean. I talk about social and emotional understanding, the sort of thing that is absent in people with autism. And cognitive intelligence, this may surprise people, but all these things, and creativity. So creativity, intelligence of the cognitive kind, IQ kind, emotional and social intelligence, apprehension is a separate case, I'll come to that in a second. Perception, attention, and judgment, all these are better performed by the right hemisphere. Only apprehension is better performed by the left hemisphere. So the only thing the left hemisphere is better at is getting a hold on either an idea, very precise, clear one, or on a thing that it wants to use. But all the manifold complexity which our intelligence brings to bear in order to understand the world, all of that is better done by the right hemisphere. And I can say that on the basis not just of experiments in normal subjects, but on seeing what happens when you have either left hemisphere damage or right hemisphere damage. To summarize a vast chunk of information, which I hope will be there for people to read very, very soon. To summarize that very briefly, what one would say is that when you have damage to the right hemisphere, your grasp of reality is the main thing that's impaired. You don't understand it, you don't connect with it. Your ability to understand what's going on disappears. Whereas when you have a right hemisphere, when you have a right hemisphere, when you have a left hemisphere stroke, the main things are you have difficulty speaking and using your right hand. They're practically very important. But essentially the understanding of the world, the grasp of the meaning of the world, as you see the word grasp again, the overall comprehension of the world is sustained by the right hemisphere.
Okay, so let me ask you a question.
Can I?
Sure, go ahead.
Right, okay.
And then, yeah.
All right, okay. Let me just make this point.
Yeah.
Because I want to. People might say, well, okay, but so what? We've both got right and left hemispheres, so we're not missing anything. So does it matter? Well, yes, it matters very importantly for my philosophical project. Because as I show in the second part of the book, where I look at the proper contributions to understanding made by reason, science, intuition, and imagination, what I can show is that in those attempts to grasp, we can see the world. We can see the signature of the right hemisphere or the signature of the left hemisphere on a particular model. So if we have two possible models of a certain action or an aspect of reality or space or time, which I deal with in the third part of the book, and indeed in philosophical history and in the history of physics and so on, there have tended to be opposing views of the world. Once you know how the left hemisphere sees it and how the right hemisphere tends to see things, you can see the hallmark of the left hemisphere's understanding on a certain philosophical standpoint, on a certain scientific take of the world. And you can see the hallmark and the imprint of the right hemisphere in certain other ways of reasoning and of science and philosophy. So this is very important, because up till now, we've never been able to judge between these two. We've got A, we've got B, we just have to go, can't tell, we can't reconcile them, we can't do without either of them. That's true. Ultimately that's true, but we can get a very sharp idea, I believe now, of which of these is fallacious, which one is going to lead us down a blind alley, which one is out of touch with reality, and which one is more in touch with reality. I just wanted to say that, because it's behind the whole philosophical drift of my book, which is, how do we know who we are? I asked Plotinus's question, who are we? That's effectively the question. What is the cosmos? What is nature, and how do we all relate? Sorry, hand over to you.
No, that's good. Okay, so to do something, you have to zero in on it. So let me lay something out for you, and then I'm going to ask you a specific question about it. So imagine that I'm concentrating on the computer screen, I'm attending to it, I'm writing a book. Okay, so the question might be, well, what am I doing while I'm writing that book? What is it to write that book? Well, at the most focused level of my consciousness, the most focal level, that involves voluntary control of my fingers. I'm going to be typing single letters, and there are muscle movements that are associated with that, but I don't really know what the muscle movements are. I know how to move my fingers. That's the highest level of resolution I can manage. I can press T with my left hand and H with my right hand, and with these two fingers. And so that's sort of where the pedal hits the metal, in some sense. That's where my intent meets the world. Okay, so, but I'm not typing letters. Sorry, I am typing letters, but at the same time I'm typing words. And at the same time I'm typing words, I'm typing phrases. And then I'm typing sentences, and I'm typing paragraphs, and I'm typing chapters, and then I'm typing books. And then the book itself is an artifact that's nested inside higher order structures. So, well, I'm writing the book, but the reason I can write the book is because I'm imagining a world within which the book is nested. And so I'm focusing on something very specific. Like, I can't write the book without pushing the letter T with my left index finger. But I also can't write the book without apprehending the book as a whole. And you know, when I edit not letters because I can spell, but I edit words. I substitute one word for another. I edit phrases, I edit sentences, I edit at the paragraph level. All of these levels actually exist. Now, is it reasonable to suppose? So, sorry, I'm going to add one more level outside that. So you might ask, well, why am I writing a book? And it might be, well, because I'm a practicing scientist. And why is that important? Well, I'm a dutiful citizen, let's say. I'm trying to uphold my moral responsibility. And you might say, well, why is that important? And I would say, well, that's part of my proper moral engagement with the world. And then I can't go farther outside than that. Now, is it reasonable to suppose, if you think about that whole structure as a kind of lens that focuses us into the world, is it reasonable to suppose that it's the left hemisphere, so to speak, that's concentrating on the T's and the H's, and that as you move up that hierarchy to broader and broader levels of conceptualization, that the manner in which those higher levels are conceptualized shifts more and more to the right, or is processed more and more by the right? Is that a reasonable way of looking at it?
I think you could, but I think it sort of glosses a bit. And what you beautifully described is what the right hemisphere knows, which John Muir summarized by saying, if you try to get hold of any one thing and pull it, you find that it will bring with it the whole of the rest of the universe. Yet that sentence you're writing is informed by your personal history and the history therefore of your culture, and therefore and so on and so on and so forth. So everything that has gone to make you is present in that bit of the book. And so you're not, of course, at any one time aware of more than a tiny bit, but there's a very fallacious and superficial argument that if you're not conscious of it, in that sense of the word conscious, then somehow you're not doing it. But of course you are. The whole thing emanates from what I call the field of view. Now, suppose rather than, you can take the example of the typing. I mean, you wouldn't be able to type at all if you were thinking about what your fingers were doing. But nonetheless, it would be stupid to say that you're unconscious while you're typing. Of course you're not unconscious. Somebody playing a Bach fugue has got to use all their fingers and their hands, and their feet at the same time. And if they concentrated, they could only concentrate and focus on one finger. Of course, that would stop the whole music from start. But they're conscious, of course. They're just as conscious when the whole thing's happening as they are if they think about the finger and stop it. So what this illustrates is what Alfred North Whitehead was keen to point out, that as soon as we master something, we relegate it to another part of the mind that we don't any longer have to focus on.
Finally.
The focusing of attention is costly. He said it's like cavalry charges in battle. It should only be done rarely. You need fresh horses, and it comes at a high cost. So that's a good analogy. Because
you build a little machine.
The things that we do unconsciously are in no way inferior stuff. So, for example, the Bach fugue is not inferior. When a surgeon is learning, he or she has to be very conscious of what he or she is doing, the actual business of the hand tapping. But when the surgeon is very skilled, he can hum and listen to the radio, chat with colleagues, and it's all happening. Similarly, a chess player, a bad chess player, has to be conscious of every move, but a really good one is not unconscious, it's very, very highly conscious, but it's not focused. Now, my distinction, finally answer your question, is that focused attention, this focal attention for detail, is what the left hemisphere does. It can only take in about 3 degrees of sensible height, so it's incredibly limited. And as Whitehead says, it has its uses in an emergency, but really it's not a satisfactory way for living. And what I think is happening is that we are now more and more saying anything that I'm not actually focusing on right now doesn't exist. All the implicit stuff, all the unconscious stuff, all the things that go to make up the richness of our both cognitive and emotional and body itself isn't really important. We focus down on this tiny bit that the relatively unintelligent left hemisphere knows about and is aware of. So when I say conscious and unconscious, I like to say, don't think of these as two separate realms, like, two tanks with perhaps a trap that things can pop up from the lower tank into the higher tank or whatever. But instead think of it like a stage, and there's a spotlight, and the spotlight may just illuminate one part of the stage. The rest of the stage hasn't gone anywhere, it's still there, and you just need to move the spotlight and suddenly it's there again in the middle of what you're thinking about. That's how I would see that question.
Okay, so
Now I have to cut that hole for that thing.
Yeah. So when you learn to type, you're going to be paying conscious attention to pushing the T's and the H's. As you learn to type, you start perhaps being conscious more of, maybe you're attending at the level of the phrase. Like, you don't have to be consciously attentive to those things you've built automated machinery for. Now they say when kids learn to read, it isn't enjoyable to begin with because it's effortful to learn to process the letters, and it's effortful to learn to process the words. And it's not until they can automatize the letter and word processing, and so they can read the word at a glance, that they start to be able to be conscious of the phrase and the sentence, and that's when they get the meaning from the text, and that's when it starts to become enjoyable, right? It's not just effortful. And then, so the consciousness of a reader isn't consciousness of letters, and it's not consciousness of words. It's consciousness of something like the interplay between sentences and paragraphs. And it's like your consciousness floats above the highest level of automatization that you've been able to manage. Does that seem reasonable to you?
Well,
I mean, when you're playing a musical piece, for example, you don't pay attention to what you've practiced because you've got that. you pay attention to the sequencing of what you've practiced. And the greater a musician you are, the higher up in the abstraction hierarchy you can focus, because you've automated all the lower stuff.
Well, yes, and that comes back to what?
No, I'm trying to get the relationship between that and the hemispheric specialization.
Well, I think I've done my best to point out that the right hemisphere is the one that is able to attend to the whole gestalt. Ultimately, it's dealing not in fragmentary entities that have to be put together, but in gestalten that already exists, and unnested, so that you go down from one level and you find another. You know, famously, you can go from the body to the organ, to the tissue, to the cell, to the organelle, to the, you know, and each of these at each stage is a whole that has its own qualities and its own rules, really, and works in a semi-autonomous way. So there's always freedom between the levels of understanding. There's always space. It's rather like the gaps in the structure of where the light gets in. What we're trying to do all the time is to know enough to be able to act, but to leave it open so that we can know more and really understand what we're acting. So I think these are and very direct in the way in which it achieves or aims to achieve its goal. And the right hemisphere, which is sustaining is also seen to go in a wider role. You know, the reason of typing these letters is not just to make people unaware of it, but will know about it soon. So I think it's the difference. I mean, it's very, again, Whitehead says as a civilization advances by the number of actions that can be made automatically or below the level. Sorry?
That's actually how time should be measured.
Without
the number of things occurring.
Because thinking is a very complex thing, isn't it? I mean, what is it? And a number of people have commented, rather along the lines that I'm saying, that it's not so much right to say I think as in cogito, but in the words of Lichtenberg, the 18th century German philosopher and physicist, es denkt in mir, something is thinking in me, and that is the me. It's not separate, and it's not unconscious in the sense of it has no life, it has no meaning, it has no purpose, it has no direction. Absolutely not. It has all those things. And one of the things I'm trying to argue in the last part, may I say something just about the structure of this book? I started off on it, this new book.
Yes,
I'm just going to say a little bit more about it. Yeah. So
we're trying to grasp something large going through its parts. So it's not such a simple thing to do.
It's not a simple thing to do. So the first part of the book I've explained. It gives one an insight into a simple fact that in terms of having access to the reality of the world, the right hemisphere is better than the left. And it has a special take, if you like, which we can recognize. So that when we're having to choose between two opposites, we can choose one. We want to go with the other. And in the second part of the book, I'm looking at the pathways to knowledge, using attention, perception, judgment, intelligence, on how do we put them to use? Well, I think the main ones are science, reason. I think most people would say they're important. I would say intuition and imagination are also vastly important. Now, none of these is infallible. None of these can say that it can deal with everything. There are proper limits to science, otherwise you're peddling untenable, naive scientism. But it is a very important thing for us to respect and to do honorably. And reason is enormously important. I use science and reason as the basis of my book. But again, reason, as Pascal, famous mathematician and philosopher, said, reason is poor if it cannot see its own limitations. And so it has limitations, but it can achieve a very great deal. And the same actually is true of intuition. It's had very bad press in recent years because I think, again, psychologists, I think you alluded to this, they like things that can be taken down into bits and shown them, we can find the mechanism. Intuition's a bit hard for that. And imagination has been, again, relegated to the sort of children's play box. this is something to do with fantasy, whereas in fact I argue that quite the opposite, that whereas fantasy may be an interesting decoration on things that we already know, and the left hemisphere can do that, imagination is actually how we go to meet the world and understand it. And we have to imagine it into being. There is no alternative. If we are not imaginatively engaged with the world, we just can't see a lot of things that are there.
Well,
So we need to use all of these faculties together, not just one or two as we now do. Sorry, Karen.
Well, I wanted to comment on your discussion of imagination and the manner in which it brings the world into being. So we've already discussed the fact that the realm of your experience is dependent to some degree on your attention, and that's associated with intent. And intent seems to me to be, it's future oriented. To have an intent means to attempt to move from one place to another, and hypothetically it's a better place because why move otherwise? And so to act in the world with intent means that you're playing out something that's imaginative, because to posit that one thing is better than another and therefore want to move towards it, you have to have imagined up a better world. And so what that means in some sense is that we're always meeting the world in a way that imposes our imaginative attempts to make it better upon us, upon the world, but that also brings the world into being. And so and I guess I'm saying that because I'm trying to grapple with the why of your book again. You're implying throughout, more than implying, that we have a paucity of viewpoint that's demotivating and dangerous. And you're implying as well that has something to do with our obsessive concentration or utilization of left hemisphere functions. That reminds me of Heidegger to some degree in his claim that modernists use the world as produce, that we tend to reduce everything to its functional utility insofar as it can be exploited. Like, I have some sympathy for that because we have to exploit the world to live, but so let's say we do lose something by being specific and narrow. We gain something which is functional utility. What do we do about that? You're trying to understand it and why it is. What do we do to fight against it?
Well, that's a whole separate question. But at the moment I'm trying to unpack what the problem is and
okay, well I won't push past that for now then. That's
I mean, quite what we do about it is the $1 million question, and we may not be in a position unless we radically alter the way in which we think about the world, understand it and feel it, and experience it and interact with it. We may not have a world in which to live. So it's a pretty important topic. But so having sort of more or less, as it were, gone over what are the portals to understanding, what are the paths to understanding, I then in the part 3, which is really, if you like, the reason we've had part 1 and 2, you can't get to part 3 without them, but when you get there, we want to know, so what is the world like? And so I look at the structure of the world, the theories about it, and what we can tell from physics and from the hemisphere hypothesis, what parts of it we may be perceiving with the left hemisphere and what we may be seeing with the right. And I look at the structure in the sense of the coming together of opposites and the very interesting philosophical question of the relationship between the one and the many. And then in the rest of the book, I look at time, space, motion, meaning largely flow, but all kinds of motion, matter and consciousness, value, purpose, and the sense of the sacred. Now I argue that these elements like consciousness are not secondary, they're not derivative, it's actually irrational, I suppose they are. Reasoning on the side of the fact that they are ontological primaries. And I argue that actually also...
Unpack that for people, because there's a lot...
But it would take
there's
a
a lot
very
nested
long
inside
time.
that.
Well, I can unpack the phrase. What I mean by ontological primary is that it can't be reduced to other terms. It can't be said that as long as you look at the brain in a certain way, you can work out what consciousness is. Consciousness is sui generis. It is of its own kind. It is not something that is derived from anything. It has to be a primary constituent of the universe. This is not a particularly any longer controversial view. It's held by many philosophers now in the form of panpsychism, in which something like consciousness is in the cosmos, and the cosmos perhaps exists inside consciousness, not my consciousness, but a consciousness field. And there are plenty of neuroscientists who say this too. Robert Colin Blakemore, not known for being kind of away with the fairies, but they say this too. But I would also argue, and it's a perhaps harder thing to make comprehensible in a very short space, but that actually values are things that are there. They're not things we make up. They're not things that are like, I rather like that. They are built into the drive of everything. And I think the cosmos has drives. You can describe them in all sorts of ways. It has the fact that it changes and moves in certain ways according to, quote, laws, which may actually not be laws, but may be temporary habits. We don't know. They may be evolving too. But the very fact that this thing has this energy to evolve, to differentiate, to produce differentiation within union, this is a value of a kind. You can't get behind these. And most of our values, other than those of utility, this is good for me and I want to have more of it, which is what the left hemisphere is devoted to. Most of those other values are not reducible to sheer, material greed or feathering your own nest. They're often actually the things that are vastly cool. Probably the whole point of the being consciousness at all is to come to appreciate the meaning of truth, goodness and beauty, to have a sense of something awe-inspiring, which is really what we mean when we talk about the sacred. We're humble enough to say we don't know everything, we probably will never know. I mean, why should we? That's also a totally irrational idea that our brains are so constructed that we should know everything. I mean, a mouse might think that it thinks that much, you think it knows everything, but it doesn't, and we're evolving. There may be creatures in the future who think, what the hell did Homo sapiens in 2021 know, So I just want to get back into the frame that not all the things that matter to us, they are enormously important aspects of the universe that is not dead and static unless given a push, not without purpose, not without meaning, not without value. These things are in the grain, in the warmth and the weft of the cosmos. Of that I'm certain. And the job is for us to find this. And most philosophers, wise people, sages, whatever you like to call them, in the past, have adopted a view of the cosmos, which is exactly the one that one would expect the right hemisphere to hold, which is one in which things are not always certain or known, they're changing, they're interconnected, but the whole thing has a meaning. It is not a heap of fragments that don't mean anything, the modern malaise. So that's really where I'm driving at, as you see. That's the philosophical goal, is to help people see something that I think they already intuit. I mean, that was a response to the master in his entry. I mean, apart from people enormously movingly writing to me saying things I never thought I would ever hear from writing a book, like your book changed my life, and I'm sure you've had this too. But, people saying, what you're saying, I kind of knew. I've known this, but I couldn't find any way of articulating it. Mm-hmm. Well, there's a reason why you couldn't find a way of articulating it, and that is articulation in language is controlled by the left hemisphere. It developed very good tools for mapping out the world in a way that is very useful to its purposes. But the important things are hard to articulate in words. They're implicit meanings. All the deep things like love, religion, poetry, music, how do you say these in words? How do you say them in language? But they have extraordinary meaning and power. They're the things we live for, not for the things that we can say, put down in a notebook.
So what's driven you in this direction, do you think? I mean, you made a very large number of claims in that last section, thought.
Yeah.
For example, you come to the belief that value is somehow implicit in the structure of being. That's what I understood what you said, and correct me if I'm wrong, and that it's,
No, that's right.
okay, that it's unfolding across time. And, I mean, I've been thinking about that exact issue an awful lot. Do you, it's very difficult to formulate this question. So imagine that we're drawn towards an ideal. Human beings are drawn towards an ideal. Imagine that you can detect that draw by your own dissatisfaction in part, is that you don't feel you're living properly, or your conscience is bothering you. You feel that there's something more to be attained. You're embarrassed at your insufficiencies, right? So there's this ideal that's pulling you onward and judging you at the same time. And that ideal might be, well, the ideal human being. That's one way of thinking about it. And that's partly why I got so interested in hero mythology. I mean, is it a reasonable conclusion of your line of thinking that the notion of the ideal human being is somehow built into the structure of the cosmos? Because the classic, I don't know how to.
No, it's not. No, I don't think that at all. I want to scotch that.
Okay, well, how do you scotch that if you start with your presuppositions? Like,
because my presuppositions have nothing to do with an already conceived plan that is just being acted out.
No, I wasn't implying. It wasn't necessarily.
Oh, all right. Well, okay, but all right. Okay. Well, I'm glad you weren't. But a lot of people think that if I say these things, I must be positing an engineering God who sort of tinkers with things and makes things happen according to his purpose.
Yeah, okay, that's fair. I mean, I was implying that in some sense. I mean, the question would be, where does your insistence that values are part of the structure of being, like, where does that find its limit? Because the classic limit of that is something like, in fact, the definition of the utmost place of value in some sense is almost indistinguishable from the claim that there is a God. So
a God is not the same as an engineering God. And I speak the practice on the principle of sacred, in which I try to help people to a place where they can understand why people use this extraordinarily difficult word, God. You know, it's not a satisfactory term, but it's the term we have to name an aspect of our experience that if we don't name it, disappears from our lives. And that's not to say that there isn't something there that merits whatever we mean when we say divine. I mean, we haven't defined what we mean by divine. And we're back in the nets of language. We're trapped in the nets of language, as Schelling said. But what I'm suggesting is that, as Whitehead suggested, and come on, Whitehead, who was also the co-author with Russell of the Principia Mathematica, he wasn't a fantasist. He had this, I think, incredibly deep idea that whatever one likes to call the divinity, God, whatever, is the thing that cosmos has relation. Relation is at the core of being. I even argue that relation is prior to the relator, prior to the things that are related. That sounds nonsense. How can you relate? How can you have a relation if there isn't anything yet to relate? But there's a wonderful image called, in Indian mythology, called Indra's net, which covers the universe. And in it, the idea is that the filaments of the net exist before the net, before the crossing points, which are the things we see. And on those crossing points, there are little gems which reflect every other gem in the net. And that would take a very long time to unpack. Perhaps it can set things going in people's minds. But the idea I have...
A gesture to the right hemisphere.
is that relation is prior to anything at all, really. And that therefore, whatever we mean by God and whatever we mean by the cosmos are in some sort of dynamic relation, which is an evolving one, in which the outcome is excitingly not known. If it were known, it would all be some horrible, possibly sadistic play by an almighty, all-knowing God. I mean, look, I'm going to be talking to Rowan Williams shortly, but I don't want to go into all And I mean by that, I don't think God is omniscient and omnipotent, but I don't think he's not either. Just in the same way I don't think he's greed, and I don't think he's not greed. I think the terms are wrong, but we can go there if we want another day. But the thing, what I'm going to say is that God is becoming unfulfilling, whatever God is, through the relationship which classically in most religions is described as love, which is after all just like a form of gravity in the world of life and emotion rather than just in the world of so-called inanimate. So that therefore we are coming into being, God is coming into being, and we're necessary for one another's coming into being. It's not that God does a bit to us and then we do a bit back to God. It's like, I've read a very good book, I keep mentioning it, by a young microbiologist in America called Kriti Sharma, called Interdependence. And she argues very importantly that it's not just that, certainly it's not just that an animal or an organism molds its environment, nor is it just good enough to recognize that while an animal affects and shapes its environment, the environment shapes the animal, the organism. But that this is not a, turn by turn process. It's not that the animal shapes the environment which then, in its turn, shapes the animal. It's an entirely simultaneous process of coming into being, of co-creation. Now this idea of simultaneous coming into being is an ancient one, but I think it's a very deep one philosophically and a very important one.
But that accounts for your objection to the idea of the omniscient determining God.
Absolutely, because the God has, God would have no creation. Creation is not really just the unfolding of something that's already there. Creation.
What's the name of the book? What's the name of the book by the microbiologist?
This is called Interdependence. It's by Kriti Sharma.
Can you spell her last name?
Sharma. It's quite a short read.
Okay.
I'm mentioning her quite a lot these days.
Okay, so let me ask you a question. Now, I'm going to try to pack up what you're doing. So again, tell me if I'm wrong. So we have these opposed viewpoints of the world, paradoxical viewpoints. They're expressed. They make the hemispheric differences necessary, or they're a consequence of the hemispheric differences. If there wasn't a paradox, we wouldn't need the two hemispheres. We need these two different ways of looking at things. We're in danger of tilting too far to a left hemisphere view. And that's keeping us from what? It's keeping us from apprehension of the relationship with the sacred that you're describing, the co-creation relationship. Is that reasonable?
It's ruling out so much. I mean, I can't begin to tell you, if you can imagine, all the things that this very reduced, abstract, schematic, bureaucratic, essentially it's bureaucratic, push something, it has an action on something else, and, we can predict the outcome, we can organize it. That's the left hemisphere's vision of the world. Inanimate stuff that it can move about. Very much the Industrial Revolution was a kind of acting out in the outer world as the world picture of the left hemisphere in some ways. I talk about that more in the dentistry,
but it's phenomenally successful.
It's ruling out everything really. It's ruling out our ability to understand, to see at all. I mean, a number of very important people, one of them Goethe, said, thinking is good, but seeing is so much better. And I think we just don't see things anymore because we don't expect them, we don't understand them, we rule them out from the word go because our world picture doesn't contain them. And if you stop doing that and start attending in a more flexible way, you find there's a massively complex and fascinating, rich, nourishing response to your attention. It's the absence of that that causes the meaning crisis, which is constantly being bandied about.
But the Egyptians,
the Egyptians
knew that. The ancient Egyptians knew that.
Yeah.
Because the god Horus is the eye and its attention, and it is Horus that revitalizes Osiris, and he's the god of structure. And they saw the proper sovereignty was a combination of attention and structure, a dynamic combination of attention and structure.
But this is
Absolutely brilliant.
Well, I quite agree, but this is where we come to, I need to correct a possible misapprehension. There's nothing wrong with the view of the right hemisphere. It's in fact necessary. It's part of a dialectic backwards and forwards between these two ways in which things can be built. You can't have the one in a way without the other. You're quite right. We need them both. But we live in an age which is completely obsessed with the idea of equality as some eternal sort of truth about the cosmos. I can see no evidence for this idea. It's a lovely idea, humanly invented idea, which is a good one in society, although it can't be realized, and it may actually not be necessary or even good for it to be ultimately realized. It might lead to a horrible kind of totalitarianism, as many 20th century philosophers pointed out. But these
Well, that's the
two
problem
things
with
don't have
elevating
to
one
be-
virtue above all else. It's an hemisphere problem.
Well,
It's an ideological problem.
No, the point is this. We need the left and the right, but we need the right to be in control. Now this is very important. This is the image of the master and his emissary. The emissary and the master are not equal. The master needs the emissary and knows he needs the emissary. The emissary, being inferior, doesn't know that he needs the master. So the emissary is good as long as he's under control of the master. Now that image is extraordinarily important for understanding this picture of the cosmos, and is actually present in ancient Chinese, Iroquois mythologies and so on. This idea of there being an unequal pair, that one has to be the guardian of the other, and as long as the one that is, as it were, a potential problem remains under the supervision of the wiser one that sees it, everything works well for everybody. And that's why in the Master and his emissary I suggest
immense increase in human well-being. And they say we can continue with that into the future. We can produce a world, and perhaps are already producing a world, where poverty is increasingly going to be a thing of the past. And we can bring the rest of the world up to the standards of living that characterize the West, and we can continue to expand the pie. And I'm not interested in discussing whether that's possible or not, because it's possibly possible and possibly not. But it's a particular vision, right? It's a vision of the extension of material comfort to everyone. And that comfort has been extended tremendously over the last 200 or 300 years. It's absolutely amazing. And I would say in large part it's a consequence of that left hemisphere reduction of the world to manageable bits and the manipulation of it. And this is not to say anything negative about your thesis whatsoever. But one of the things I've noticed is that materialistic utopian vision, and I'm also not insulting Ridley or Lombard, who I admire greatly, that materialistic vision of incremental material progress has very little motive power. Like, it isn't an exciting story for some reason. what do we want? Incremental improvement. When do we want it? In due time. It's not a gripping story. It's lacking something. And you seem to be pushing towards something that might be the medication for that lack. There's nothing in that vision that speaks of like a grand destiny for the individual or for society. And there are many religious traditions that insist that human beings exist in a relationship with the divine, and that it's only in living out that relationship that life is imbued with the proper kind of meaning. And proper means sufficient to keep you from malevolence, I suppose, sufficient to be in love with life. Now, you posited in some of your statements a while back that when we're in this co-creation relationship with the divine, and that isn't too far off, from my understanding, of many classical religious propositions that human beings participate in the act of creation. Whether we participate in the act of creating God is a whole different question, but we can leave that aside. I mean, so then the question is, what's the question that arises out of that? I'm still trying to drive down at exactly what the main point you're making. You've worked on this book for a tremendous amount of time. Something's driving you hard, and it's the revelation of a solution to a very important problem. And the revelation seems to be something like an attempt to explicate a higher order vision something that we can aspire to.
And the right of this is that I don't think that we live in an enlightened era. We live in what David Bohm called an endarkened era, in which what we think is enlightening us is in fact inducing misery. The strange thing is that unarguably when people are enormously poverty-stricken, and of course one needs then to define what poverty is, are people who lead the lives that their ancestors lived as hunter-gatherers. Are they poor, or do they only become poor when their whole world is ripped apart and they're brought into the nearest large industrial slum and have no bearings on life, no relationship with the world, no pride, and their health suffers and they kill themselves? So what is poverty? That is a very important question first. But also remedying poverty, extreme poverty, is of course enormously important. No feeling person could argue against that. But it's not enough. As one rather well-known historical figure said, a man cannot live by bread alone. And the thing is that there's only bread in this story. But that leaves out everything. He plays the part of a publisher who says, the trouble with your book is that it lacks everything. And I feel that this kind of philosophy lacks absolutely everything. It's got nothing whatever to offer. Now, let me just put some facts to this, because it may sound, it's just my opinion. What do we know? Well, fortunately, going back to the 30s, school children in America, in a certain system, have been asked the same questions about their happiness in life at the same age, going back now 70 years. And Jean Twenge, who has looked at this data, which avoids all sorts of problems of defining what you mean by happy and retrospectoscopes and all the rest. You've got the data from the 1930s, the 40s, the 50s, and nowadays the numbers of children that would qualify by a very well authenticated and commonly used standard of being depressed is 5 to 8 times what it was in the 1930s when poverty was a big issue. So 5 or 8 times, not 5 or 8% more. So there's something horrendous we're doing to ourselves. Suicide rates are going up, particularly among women who register much greater dissatisfaction with life now than they did 10 years ago, interestingly. Because one might think that a number of things that would have made life hard for them have been removed. But it just shows how complicated it is knowing what works well for people. And 3 things overall. three things seem to be incredibly important for human fulfillment and happiness. And one of them I touched on at the end of the Master Presents, which is feeling socially connected, being bound into a meaningful community of trust. That's one. The second has been in the presence of nature. Just going off for half an hour into a forest and being quiet has an effect on your blood pressure, on your physical health and so on. And these effects, if practiced, are greater than those in going to the gym. And the thing that's really struck me is there's the Oxford Handbook of Religion, as it's called, but it looks at enormous bodies of evidence about the well-being of people who are adherents to religion and those who are not. And not only, as you very well might expect, are the people who are not adherents to religion much more prone to anxiety, depression, drug addiction, they cope with less well with crisis, they're more vulnerable generally, but they're actually physically not so well. So, for example, rates of stroke, of heart disease, are comparably better amongst the believing group and the unbelieving group, with the difference between those who do cardio exercise, for several hours a day, and even smoking. It's a more powerful effect than smoking. Social connectedness is more powerful than smoking. Being in nature, I think, is more powerful than smoking, and being a part of a religious community that worships and even holding spiritual views to some extent is a mitigator against unhappiness and illness. So, is that any answer to your question of why I don't think that Matt Ridley's idea of it's totally left hemisphere idea, to sort of crank out some more government departments do some marvelous technical things and everybody gets living in a Amsterdam and happiness. I don't believe it.
Well, I don't think he believes that. I mean, he's a complicated person, and he's more concerned with applying material resources where they can be most effectively applied. I think the question of what material comfort and plenitude needs to be embedded in is a different question. I think it's reasonable to say, well, we should do what we can to alleviate destitution and catastrophic poverty. We should improve child nutrition. We should eradicate tuberculosis. Obviously, right. The question is, what does that have to be nested inside for it to be worthwhile? And that's what you're aiming at. And I believe is what does that need to be nested in to make it worthwhile? And you've come to this conclusion. Was this a shock to you over the years that you came to the conclusion that? Okay, why not? I mean, the reason I'm asking is because it isn't an everyday occurrence, in some sense, for a committed scientist to point out that the scientific viewpoint needs to be embedded inside a broader, value-oriented viewpoint, something I believe, but it isn't an everyday occurrence for that to be stated forthrightly, and as a scientist, it isn't necessarily the first thing that would come to mind. But have you always thought this way, or have you come to this as a consequence of your thinking?
Well, I have the advantage of having come to science from a fairly thorough grounding in the humanities. So I had a philosophy of life that was based on reading, thinking, talking, and I was a relatively aged customer when I started to study medicine, compared with most people who do that, at least in this country. So I brought a background which has always been my passion, an interest in philosophy, but not just a kind of forever analytic philosophy, which it's more or less like sort of angels dancing on a pinhead and breaking everything down to the tiniest parts. This doesn't really particularly interest me, but a kind of more human philosophy, which doesn't become theology, but which is open to the idea that there is more in the world than we can know or understand.
But it sounds like it is, that it has become theology. This isn't a critique. like it's an attempt to observe what you're telling me. It's not a critique at all. I'm trying to understand this.
Well, it depends what you mean by theology. You see, I don't think the most important part of the relationship with God is necessarily theology. I'm not disrespectful of theology, but
you claim that people are involved.
I've read a lot of, for example, the Kabbalah. I've acquainted myself with Buddhist philosophy, and I've always been very interested in Taoism, Hinduism, and the deep wisdom of these things, including, as I say, North American native people, and even circumpolar people. I mean, the wisdom is embodied in their mythology. We think of these as somehow childish myths, but in fact, these myths contain, and in fact are the only way of containing, or not containing, they're not ever contained, but of transmitting, bringing into being for other people the things that are the deep truths, and it's that motivates me. I have only one, I'm not going to be alive much longer. I mean, I'm not in imminent danger of dying, but I mean, we're all actually here for an extraordinarily short time, and there's great wisdom in the past in having a memento mori on your desk, skull. And we're not here for very long, and it behoves us to behave and to understand the world in the most fruitful way for human fulfillment and happiness, and for the greater fulfillment of whatever it is that we sense in whatever is around us, in the being of the world. And the word cosmos keeps coming to mind, which also in its root means beautiful, because I think what one sees when one looks at the natural order is that it is, as scientists and mathematicians are constantly saying, it's outstandingly beautiful, complex order. Why? Where does that come from? Well, I don't pretend to have an answer, but I see the difference is between people who think they know the answer and people who don't. I'm one of the people who don't think they know the answer, so please don't ask me what the answer is. I think I would disqualify myself from having anything worthwhile to say if I thought I had the answer. The difference is not between atheists on the one hand and believers on the other, but it's between fundamentalist believers and fundamentalist atheists on the one hand, and people who often call themselves honest agnostics on the other. That openness of mind, that willingness to acknowledge that one doesn't know everything, that one's reaching and searching for something, is far more fruitful and spiritual to me than saying, I know it, it's written down in this book, and these are the rules.
I want to go back to I listened to all of that, and I want to go back to this co-creation idea, because that's not a trivial idea. That's an overwhelmingly massive idea.
That's reality.
And
wow.
see, the audiences I've talked with, I've talked about the necessity of a vision of life that's sufficiently demanding, meaningful, to justify the trouble of existence. And it seems to me that it's necessary psychologically to be in pursuit of a noble goal. And there isn't a goal that's more noble than the one that you outlined, virtually by definition, right? I mean, if you're co-creating the cosmos, but also if you're in a co-creating relationship with God, that involves you at the highest level of being, with the structure of being.
It does.
Well, again, because we're talking inevitably in shorthand, because this is why this would be so colossally long. I mean, it's apparently as long as the Bible. The reason I had to do that is that what I'm doing is nothing less than this. I'm saying the whole way in which you are taught by your education, by science, popular science, not by quantum physicists who have a very much more sophisticated grasp of philosophy, but by the sort of 19th century mechanists who still dominate biology unhappily. A version of sort of engineering, if you ever like. This is not a good way to think. This is not even likely to be true. It doesn't answer to any aspect of experience of the world except the most tiny detail. So, for example, what I think is that the whole structure of things is infinitely complex and has many recurring loops in it. And when you can't, and it's just an organism like that, or even a cell, or even, part of a cell, an organelle, is amazingly complex. The number of interactions, the number of chemical reactions that are going on there is colossal, and they all have cascades that interact with one another. However, if you take from this very large picture right down to the tiniest bit of light, you can see a little chain of arrows. This leads to that, leads to that. You can't see all kinds of other things, and you can identify that. And that's what we're good at doing. And we say, if I interfere in that, I can cause something to happen, which might be beneficial, for example, to somebody who has a health condition. So I'm not saying there's anything wrong with any of this. Again, I come back to there's nothing wrong with the left hemisphere. There's only something wrong with it when it adopts the hubristic cloak of knowing everything. And when you said scientists are not often heard to voice the sort of things that I'm saying and that you are saying, I'd like to say that physicists very often do, but that biologists relatively less often do now, although in the early part of the century there were many great biologists such as J.B.S. Haldane, his father John Scott Haldane, Conrad Howard Wallington, Ludwig von Bertalanffy in Austria, who saw a very sophisticated vision of the living world of biology. But what happened was, because of the great successes in molecular engineering after the war, this vision, which as I say is technically correct, you can interfere at the detail and do something very valuable, but the mistake is to extrapolate from that, to say this is the structure of the whole thing we're looking at. It's not like that. There are at least 8 or 9 ways in which a living being is not like a machine. So I am sorry that scientists diminish themselves by adopting this very narrow vision of what life is. Because after all, the whole point of science, as Schrödinger said, is to answer the question, who are we? And if it's not answering that question, and it's not assumable into an answer to that question, it's not really getting us to what the meaning of our life demands from us. That we have not an answer to the question, who are we? Not an answer to the question, what is the meaning of life? Of course, by definition there isn't one. But the very knowledge that we have to strive for it and not lose sight of it is very, very important. There's a saying in the Midrash, you're not obliged to finish the work, but you are not permitted to cease from it. And I think that is, I would say that is my vision of what I do. I think it's what all seekers after truth have to do, whether they're philosophers or scientists. And, I would love science to be more scientific. The curious thing is I honour science deeply, and I think that it has nothing to lose by making, being a little bit humbler than it is, by accepting that there is a lot that is deeply puzzling, and that the more we know about physics, the more we understand what we don't know. And it's not scientific to rule out certain ways of thinking, to say that thinking in terms of organic wholes, in terms of Gestalten and so forth is somehow not scientific. No, it's just not the way that a certain very narrow form of science is practiced. And I want science, before I die, to become more open, as science should be, to be more questioning, more imaginative. In writing this book, I've had a lot to do with the story of how science has made their discoveries, how mathematicians made their discoveries. And they very rarely, if ever, as George Gaylord Simpson himself said, one of the great mainstream molecular biologists of the last century, it's very rare that they make them by following the scientific method. The scientific method is a retrospective thing that is fitted on to what actually happened, which is extraordinary insights of intuition, seeing shapes, testing them out, of course, which is a scientific method, of course. But it's not this kind of boring, rule-bound thing that it's often made out.
Well, I think with that statement, that's a good place to end for today. It was a nice conclusion. Gone for an hour and a half or so, and I appreciate very much you talking with me. Hopefully we can do this again. I want to get further through your book. I'll keep everybody posted as to the progress of the book and to where they can obtain it when that becomes possible. Is there anything else that you wanted to mention today that you want to bring up before we close?
Well, no, I want to say, first of all, which I haven't really had an opportunity to say, how enormously glad I am that you are, back in debate with us all. And long may that be. And I think the conversations we have are good. I hope other people may think that too.
Well, we're going to put that to the test.
And I'd like to just draw people's attention to the fact that in the last 6 months, since 6 months, I think 6 or 7 months, we've developed something called Channel the Gilchrist, which is a place on the internet where you can find out more about my stuff. You can see talks, lectures, podcasts, things I've done, what I'm doing, and generally keep up to date. There's a forum there where you can enter into and discuss my work. There's a place where you can ask questions of me, so once a month I answer 4 questions out of a list of things that members of the, because you can either be a non-member or a member, but if you're a member you can ask me a question which I will then spend a quarter of an hour answering. So, that's my attempt to try and give back something that isn't just, the odd book every 10 years. So,
well, we'll make sure that we put the links and all of that in the description of this video. And with any luck, we'll get a chance to talk again in the future after we've both digested this and this conversation. It's really good to see you again.
Oh, and thank
Alright. That actually got a full day's work in here. I'm going through more than one podcast. Well, I haven't listened. I did listen. Let's see what's going on in the world.
For example, there's a situation where there's an estimation of somewhere between 700 billion and $1.3 trillion. If we hire more IRS agents, then we go after those folks who are avoiding taxes at the top end.
Well, that's what we want. That's what they want. They want freaking more IRS investigations. How about leave us alone?
Welcome to episode 79 of the Caleb Peterson podcast. In this episode, I had Kelly Brogan on. This was one of my favorite podcasts. Kelly is sharp. She's a psychiatrist, now a holistic psychiatrist, author of the New York Times bestselling book, A Mind of Your Own, Own Yourself, the children's book, A Time to Reign, and co-editor of the landmark textbook, Integrative Therapies for Depression. If you're suffering from depression or mental illness or relationship problems or emotional problems, this episode is really worth watching and taking seriously. She's the founder of the online healing program Vital Mind Reset and the membership community Vital Mind Project. She completed her psychiatric training fellowship
before I do
at
that,
NYU Medical Center after
here's what I'm
graduating
doing here.
from Cornell University Medical College and has a Bachelor of Science from
I'm just going to do it
MIT
from underneath.
in Systems Neuroscience. She specializes in a root cause resolution approach to psychiatric syndromes and symptoms. She's a powerhouse. We spoke about psychiatry and conventional Western medicine and alternative medicine, super alternative. SSRIs messed me up. They helped me initially, then ruined my life for a number of years after I stopped taking them. So this is a topic very close to my heart. If you enjoy these episodes, please hit subscribe. This episode is
We're
brought to
on
you by
SSRIs
Super
for a short period of time.
a kratom company.
That's worse than any
Kratom is a
psychedelic.
herb related to the coffee plant. Leaves or extracts from the leaves have been used as a stimulant and a sedative. It works on opiate receptors in the brain. So
I do not agree with your endorsement of, maybe I was using too much of it, but
If you tried CBD and you felt like it isn't quite what you're looking for,
I
or
think it's
you
a real
tried
dangerous thing.
you also want to try something else, kratom might be for you. There have also been reports of kratom abuse, but whenever you try anything, don't be stupid. Don't drink 12 cups of coffee a day or you'll get withdrawal.
It's
Do your
true.
research and decide. Drugs are drugs. I myself occasionally like kratom and think it can be beneficial if used properly. I've used it as a substitute for coffee. Coffee doesn't make me feel good. Or as an overall calming tea. Some people use it to manage stress and to help them relax. I know how hard this year has been and is on people, and something like kratom tea is safer in my opinion than a pharmaceutical. It's very effective. Super Speciosa has different strains. Some help you relax and give you energy. Whatever you're looking for, they have you covered. This kratom is reliable, third-party lab tested, and approved under the American Kratom Association's Quality Standards Program. Only natural kratom, no other ingredients. Visit getsuperleaf.com/MP to buy small servings or in bulk. Either way, you'll be saving a lot of money to get guaranteed high-quality kratom. So if you want to try kratom, you get 20% off by going to getsuperleaf.com/MP, enter code MP for 20% off. Thanks, Super Speciosa, for the sponsorship. Enjoy the episode. Dr. Kelly Roden, welcome to my podcast.
It's an honor.
It's an honor for me. I'm so excited to talk to you. I've known about you for a while, but it's cool getting you on the podcast. So thank you.
I'm excited. Yes, thank you.
Can we start off by you giving a brief background about who you are and what it is you do?
Yeah, I guess the most relevant and interesting detail about my sort of resume, so to speak, is that I have had many, many rebirths, right? So I'm probably on like my 8th personality in this lifetime. And I was very, very much kind of dyed-in-the-wool believer in what I now refer to as the Church of Scientism, but what was previously referred to in my life as conventional medicine. And I became interested in becoming an allopathic doctor when I was at MIT for undergrad, and I was working a suicide hotline, actually called Nightline. And completed suicide actually is a big issue at MIT, probably still is. This was some time ago, obviously, but I became really inspired and convinced that we had cracked the code of human behavior and human suffering, and that psychiatry and associated medications held the answer. And so we just needed to connect those who were suffering to the system that would help them. And I was supervised by this grandfatherly psychiatrist, and I thought, wow, I really want to do good in the world through
Mr.
this
Spatula,
field.
where'd you go?
And so I went to
Like,
medical
where-
school with that intent. And I specialized in a burgeoning field at the time called reproductive psychiatry, which is the, believe it or not, medicating with psychotropics of pregnant and breastfeeding women. I was one of the first 300 in the world. As you know, what ultimately was emerging at the time was the fact that 1 in 4 women were on psychotropic medications going into pregnancies or considering pregnancy or unexpectedly being pregnant. And we didn't have the data to help them make any sort of informed decision. And so there were a group of dedicated psychiatrists who were really focusing mostly on what's called registry data, which is the passive collection of outcomes by the pharmaceutical companies themselves to kind of inform whether or not there are any major red flags or major signals of harm. And so I spent some time, trying to help women navigate whether to continue medications, start them, discontinue them, but the only so-called alternative was just not taking your meds, right? There wasn't this concept that there's anything else to do with symptoms other than, psychotherapy, medication, or just kind of like white knuckle it. And so it really wasn't until I was pregnant myself, postpartum, and diagnosed with my first health condition. And prior to that, I had been very kind of disembodied. Like it just wasn't in this vessel. And I've always been, I guess, kind of like naturally on the thin side. So I could eat McDonald's 5 to 7 times a week and White Castle and Popeyes and candy all day long and never exercise and, take birth control. And it just wasn't a thing. I thought I was like an irritable, tired person. And that was kind of it, and when I was diagnosed with something called Hashimoto's thyroiditis, I just didn't want to take a prescription for the rest of my life. It was really a matter of convenience, but I knew that there was no other way, that the conventional system had to offer me. And so I went to a naturopath, which is so funny to me now because I was very disparaging, as you are, when you are dogmatic, of so-called alternative medicine. And I went to this a very brilliant naturopath in New York City, and she helped me to adjust my diet, and I took a bunch of supplements, and I saw on paper, which is what I needed the way my mind works. I needed that proof. I still do. And I saw on paper, my antibody levels, go from the high 2000s to normal range, and my something called TSH, normalize. And instead of feeling, so excited and wow, I just put this into remission, I was enraged. Something ignited in me that was I'm still working on. I'm still working on 11 years later. And it's like I took my sword out of my sheath and I ran naked on the battlefield. And I spent years very angry. You can even, if you've read my first book, you can, I had an amazing co-writer who helped polish me up a little bit, but you can feel it. I felt the betrayal, that a child feels when they see that their parent, injured them or harmed them, or maybe didn't have their best interest at heart in a moment. And I fought that very adolescent fight for some years against the pharmaceutical industry as a whole. At the time, I had also read a book called Anatomy of an Epidemic, and by Robert Whitaker, and he's an intrepid investigative journalist. Yeah. And you know him. And I never prescribed medication again after I turned the last page. I committed. It wasn't even an effort, actually. My entire practice for the ensuing, 11 some years to helping patients come off of medication. And so I have more experience than most of the world over because I have never started someone on medication. I've never initiated medication since that time. So I've come to really see what the dark night of the soul, that is induced by these medication withdrawal experiences and even very strategically engaged tapers, what it can really look like at a spiritual level, but also on a physiological level. Because I've said many times that I believe psychotropic medications to be the most havoc in chemical science. And there's something very, very powerful, as you know, that is engaged when you take that first potion to your lips. And so, since that time, I've done a lot of personal, spiritual work on transforming that rage and aggression and anger and righteousness, my shadow, really. And I have spent probably the past 3 or so years, but more especially since meeting my now husband, Sayer, really trying to come into, that complementary energy, that feminine energy, and the body, and really come into balance as, a mother and someone who has, heart to share as well.
Whew, okay. Part of the reason I wanted to have you on is because I've had, it wasn't exactly a similar experience, but when I found out that, like, when I put myself into remission without the medical system, like, I'm still so angry about it that it almost, like, poof. So I've been trying to work through that, and I'm not as angry as I was. Like, I used to have panic attacks going into hospital. I talked about this on a previous episode, but it wasn't something I meant to do. As soon as I put myself into remission, I had panic attacks going into hospital. And my dad was like, "That's a reasonable response, given what happened."
Yes, I would agree with that.
Yeah, but still not super convenient if I ever like break a bone and need surgery, which is might happen. But yeah, so I think we should talk a little bit about turning, especially as a woman, turning that like anger and rage and also ability to be extremely competent in research, not to like toot my own horn or anything, but I mean, you're smart, obviously, you went to MIT, then you figured out that medical community isn't exactly what everybody thinks it is, which is an insane discovery, right? And turning that into some sort of feminine spirit or power or something. I think we should touch on that a little bit, because mostly I just want to hear what you have to say from me, but I'm sure someone listening is also going to take some lesson away from it.
Yeah, no,
So
it's relevant. It's relevant to all of us right now, in this current moment, and I've come to see the sort of awareness generating experiences that we sometimes bring to ourselves. Like you mentioned being a researcher, right? A citizen researcher, and I've come to see these sort of journeys as being largely driven by our relationship to our own personal and specifically childhood trauma, because I've come at it through the intellectual, informational angle. When I started to research all pharmaceuticals that I had ever thought were sacred cows, and that includes the birth control I was taking, that includes all of the psychotropics I was prescribing, that includes antibiotics, of course I'd taken plenty of in my life, that includes vaccines, which I was in a position to have to decide around as a new mother. I am very adept at, for whatever reason related to my intellectual defenses, I'm very adept at understanding, reading, and translating scientific medical literature. And so I would collect all of these references, hundreds and hundreds of them in my blogs and my books and whatever, and I would do presentations and keynotes and all this stuff around the world. And honestly, I'm not sure I have ever changed someone's mind.
that way, yeah.
Ever. Not, like, literally not one person ever. And I'm a decent debater too, so I'm not afraid.
I'm bummed. I wanted to put some more insulation down there.
Because, when my first book came out, which was blacklisted by mainstream media, despite having gotten a very generous advance in being featured book at HarperCollins in its publishing season, I thought, well, anyone who reads this will never touch a medication again. Done. Case closed. I've made the point. There's a better way. And obviously that did not happen, which is why I wrote a second book largely about what it is that drives our devotional trust in a system that has never once demonstrated that it has our well-being in mind, nor that it defines health in the same way that we do. Right? Most know that the conventional system is terrified of death. Right? This is an existential issue that has been codified into an entire system that is now dominated.
Paper on one side now, on this side.
Around this concept of health being just the absence of death. And that's not what we experience health as.
There's
right?
paper on this side of the styrofoam.
Complex, dynamic
wood on this side.
Vitalism, right, which is more a chiropractor, sort of concept. They've been championing
See what
that
it's
for
like to
decades.
paint this shit.
So I've really come to understand this developmental, maturational arc that is the human journey, right? That requires a very important element, which is initiation, the self. In our country, I'll just speak for Americans, we have no relationship to that whatsoever.
We don't know the bad part.
Right? We don't know what it is to transition from dependency on our parents and our parents' worldview and navigating around that worldview, whether we reject it fiercely, which is what I've done, right? That rejection is still, kind of circumnavigating the authority of the parent. Sovereignty doesn't look like that. Adultification doesn't look like that.
Individuation doesn't look like that. So how do you transition from either complying or defying with your parents or a projected authority, whether that's the medical system, the doctor, the teacher, the principal of the school, whatever it is, your boss? How do you transition from that dependent patterning of relating to authority through these vectors into self-possession, into an understanding of who you are, and that your essential self doesn't need anything else in the world to change in order for you to be okay, right? It's how do you access that spine and still have your heart self to move with? That normally is done indigenously, traditionally, through some sort of initiation
This
ritual
all framed up.
that
I'm
is
really
held by
concerned about
the
the plumbing
community at
still.
large.
I have
You're
no idea
reflected
where to
that
even
when you
go.
think you're about to die, right? So let's say it's a vision quest or something like that. You don't.
You just can't find.
You don't die, and you come into contact with that deeper ground of being that will then support you as you understand who it is that you actually are, independent of those.
Yeah, I would really expect it to not be inside of anything. Makes me think.
So this should happen in our teen years, right? But instead we have this extended childhood that takes us through college, where we don't have any understanding